So, you know.
Right, perfect.
Hello, everybody. Good evening. Those of you who are joining me today. There's 12 or 13 of us in the room. And man, we've got a little bit of a treat lined up for you today. I'm going to preamble a little bit because my guest is doing something at the moment. So I will let him finish. But I'm going to give a massive shout out to those of you who are joining me, nearly 30 in the room now for today's live stream, which should be relatively interesting for all of you. So today we're going to be tackling a video called Is It Time to Retire? They Came Before Columbus, which popped up into my feed, and I just started watching it. And yeah, I was did someone send it to me, or did I just start watching it? No, it just came up in my feed. I remember it just came up in my feed on YouTube, and I started watching it. And needless to say, I wasn't over the moon with the representation of Dr. Ivan van Sertima and the information that he presented. And I can see there's a few people who are obviously seem like they're critics of Van Sertima in the chat, which is interesting to see. But you know, each to their own. I'm sure everyone's going to be mature enough here to raise mature critiques if they're going to raise them, and not name drop non sequiturs and ad hominems and be annoying, because otherwise you will get blocked. But if you're just here and you have a point of view, it's always welcome here on the King's Monologue. But in seeing this, I decided to get in contact with someone who I'd now say has become a friend in Camjiverse, who I know has tackled this subject quite extensively. And I'd love to, and I was interested in getting his feedback on the subject, and his kind of initial response was quite similar to my initial response. And then, before we give the intro to and bring Camjiverse on the live stream, there is a third matter that we're tackling today, and that's the matter of Brother Camjiverse's channel. Now, I don't know how many of you are aware, but Brother Camjiverse got demonetized recently, so his channel is no longer able to make income from the YouTube platform, and YouTube, being typically difficult, has not provided him with any reasoning as to why his channel has suffered this penalty. It seems to be something that has been automated by the AI systems, and it's just an attack on someone who's out there doing the work, providing education, providing references, providing sources, helping us to further our words. And obviously, to me personally, it's quite, I've always feel quite personally affronted, coming from someone who has a channel that is clearly and without a doubt suppressed, and has been suppressed now for over 2 years, and struggle to get every single view that I get. I totally empathize with when people's channels are brought under attack. So it's just one of those things. So I've got Brother Camjiverse here with me today. We're going to be tackling this video and this subject, which is going to be incredibly interesting, which is the subject of They Came Before the Columbus. And we're talking about the obviously pre-Columbian transatlantic contact that took place, and the proof that resides in amongst that subject, and whether or not that proof holds up to time and to scrutiny. So a lot of that is going to come under discussion today. But I also want to make sure, whilst I've got you guys here, that we all do what we can to support Brother Kamji versus various social networks and outlets that I'll be sharing with you guys. So that I hope that you can continue to follow his work. I hope he'll continue to post on YouTube, probably not with the same frequency, I'd imagine, but I hope he continues to post and yeah, just continues to grow his work. Well, that being said, I've been talking long enough, and I'm going to open the floor to Brother Kamjiverse to say hello to everybody.
How's everybody doing? Appreciate King's Monologue for just giving me the opportunity just to speak on this matter. And as he said, unfortunately, my channel was hit with demonetization, and a lot of other channels have experienced this. Demonetization, without warning. Obviously, this is targeted because there's a lot of controversial politics in relation with Africa, the African diaspora, the AES. And, as King Monologue said, like, they don't necessarily want any channel that's going to buck the trend of their mainstream narrative to be able to reach heights on the algorithm. So, I'm thankful to all of the people who supported on Patreon, who have supported via Cash App. Shout out to all the members. Unfortunately, because of the demonetization, the membership on the channel is no longer active, but you could subscribe to Substack as well as Patreon, because I'm going to try to post there a lot more frequently, as my channel is down. So this is a video, by Dr. John Aden that I was able to see, with King on Wise the Dome TV. And I have to say, me personally, I was a bit disappointed with the video because it appeared to be more polemical than scholastic. And it appeared just to follow the typical traits and patterns that we are to expect, especially when it comes to the analysis of African-centered frameworks. So, there's a lot that I noticed upon watching the video. I think I watched it one time over, and there are things that were stated that are just demonstrably false and pretty easily provable. And we're going to get into that.
Absolutely. And I don't think we need to waste too much time before we start the video, but I just want to let everyone know, I've shared as a banner on the screen Kamjiverse's links. So we have a link to his Substack there, and I'm just going to pin a link to his Substack in the comments now as well. So feel free to interact with that, or interact with those links as we do our live stream today. Turn up. Let's see Brother Kamjiverse's numbers on this Substack go up by at least 100. That would be awesome, guys. And by the way, for the 76 of you that are joining us for the live stream, let's get those likes up to at least 76 likes as well. And hopefully more people will join us as we go along. But yeah, as Brother Kamjiverse said, yeah, it's just it seemed like the video was quite, I would agree, quite polemic, and it seemed more like it was an attack on Ivan van Sertima's scholarship than it was necessarily an attack on the veracity of the claims.
Yeah,
and I guess that's probably one of the issues that I have. Now, we were talking earlier about the fact that it's not like Ivan van Sertima is someone who has gone without their critics. Yeah, it's not. So I think we can both agree that, people, I had Reggie on the channel not too long ago, Brother Reggie Maybury. We had an excellent live stream together, but he has been someone who has been openly critical of Ivan van Sertima as well. So it's not like there's any naivety here in terms of the fact that there are people who perhaps don't agree with the scholarship. But I think there's some things and claims that he's made that are just basically black and white. And, when a claim is black and white, and it's it's kind of like, well, you just have to accept that for what it is. If you want to provide additional evidence that you think counters that claim, that's one thing. but you can't just rubbish something because you don't like a particular individual. That's kind of my thoughts.
Yeah, and I kind of connected it to just the idea of frameworks. Like if you're familiar, I think I'm feeling a little bit of feedback. I don't know.
Are you getting feedback? Did you say you're getting feedback, Kamji?
Yeah. When I'm speaking, I'm getting a little bit of feedback.
Let me see if I can solve that. I think that might be.
Yeah.
Wait there. I'm gonna see if I can solve the feedback for you. Talk now. How's that?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you fine. How's the feedback?
It's like a second and a half off. Like when I talk, I hear myself. Maybe.
Have you got a window open? Oh, there's an echo. Someone said there's an echo. Okay, let me try this. Try now.
Testing. 1, 2. Testing.
How's that?
That appears good. Yeah, testing. 1, 2. Testing.
That's our screen audio. So that's going to be a bit of a problem when we actually start the stream, because I'm going to have to unmute that. I'm just trying to figure out if there's any way I can get around that.
We could maybe take turns. I don't know.
Oh, 1 second. No. Let me think. If I get rid of your... We'll figure it out. We'll figure it out. So that's gotten rid of the echo, but I'm just... If I get rid of your... How do I get rid of your mic on my monitor? I can't. No, there's no way around it. When we start actually reviewing the video, I think there's going to be a bit of an echo, and I'm not sure if there's any way around it. So apologies in advance. You're on mute now, by the way, brother. Okay, you disappeared. Kamji, you back now?
Yeah, for some reason it kicked me off. I don't know why.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's weird. That's okay, cool. Boom. All right, so let's just sit 1 second.
You see, I got a lot of fans in the chat.
It's fine. I'm just gonna say to my admins, let me know if there's any issues with people being disrespectful in the chat. Like I said, I'm happy for people to come and to raise critiques. That doesn't bother me. I don't find that in the slightest bit. But if people are being disrespectful, no. I think it's for other people as well. If people are being disrespectful, then please just kick them. So Wildflower, I need you on on checking out the respect level. Nobody's being disrespectful. Well, I disagree with you there. Someone's already said we're clowns, and I don't know about you, but I find the term clowns disrespectful. So I'm just going to give you advance warning. If you think you can call me a clown, then be expect to be kicked, because I will kick you off. All right. So please don't, gaslight me. Thank you very much. Cheers. Okay. So I think on that note, let's get going. You good to go?
Yep.
All right, let's crack. Oh, let me just give a quick shout out to Linwood, who has become a member. So shout out to you, Linwood. Appreciate the support for the channel. Okay. Shout out Linwood Obama. I like the name. Shout out to you and appreciate you joining the members, of course. All right, let's get cracking. And I agree with that as well, Superfin. So if you've seen a lot of trolls, you're on target. Yeah, sometimes. Let's get cracking. Oh, no one will be able to hear that. That's interesting. Could you hear that, Kamji?
Yeah, I heard the little breath before you paused, and I was going to mute in case there was any feedback while it was talking.
No, did you hear the video playing just then when I played it?
Yeah, play it again.
Okay, so you can hear that.
Oh, actually, I can't hear that.
You can't hear that. Okay, let me bring that back. That's fine. No worries. So I'm gonna need to unmute that.
Maybe
I think the echo's gonna come back. See if you've got on. I don't know if you've got something that's
causing.
Yeah. So if you turn down what you're hearing in the system, maybe a little bit. I don't know.
Maybe if you put it on a different browser, maybe that would work.
I don't know.
I don't know if that would, but like sometimes, like when I'm live, if I have it on the same browser, it doesn't work. But if I put it on a different browser, it does work.
Okay. All right, let's get going then.
All right.
Let's see if the only thing is if I go on a different browser, I'm gonna get ads coming up.
Oh yeah, that's annoying.
It's gonna really annoy me. Yeah. So I don't know how bad I don't know how bad the echo is now, guys, on Camg's mic, but that's how it's going to be. Let me know if it becomes unbearable at your end, Camg, and audience. Let me know if it becomes unbearable. Yeah, and we'll see if it goes from there. Okay.
For sure.
Then it was guaranteed that Marcus Garvey would come the next night. And the hall was packed with people.
Hit 1 in the chat if you can hear the audio now. You should be able to hear it now.
And everybody went with ammunition.
How they understand themselves as African, right, and American. Like, it's not either or, right?
Everybody who knows anything about Israel.
And I just want to give a quick note before we dive into this video. This is by no means an attack on either Dr. John Aden or Wise the Dome TV's channel. I'm not interested in disrespecting or bringing him down as a channel. I love people that actually put themselves out there and trying to, spread information. We can have a difference of opinions, but this is just literally the topic itself. If we feel we can add something of value to the topic, then that's exactly what we're going to do. So that's all it is here. So this is an attempt to stir up some beef with Brother Wise the Dome TV. I'm sure he's got an excellent channel, to be clear.
Israel knows that in order to effectuate significant change, you not only need a majority, you need a Jewish majority.
America awards her killers, and they get ribbons and stripes and bars. A U.S. State Department sponsored program and set of musical tours called the Jazz Ambassadors.
Talks about the work of Marcus Garvey and the work of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad as being demonstrative of, and he basically called them total nationalists.
I'm just going to skip over this just because I'm weary of being copyrighted with that music playing in the back.
You gotta say fair use before everything.
Oh, okay. Fair use. Let's go.
Peace.
Oh, by the way, Camg, I think you know how this runs. I'm gonna just let it play, and when you've got some input, just shout at me. Yeah. So just kind of go, but just give me a shout that now, and I'll do the same. If I feel some input, I'll just pause it at that point and say something.
Let's get it.
Welcome to another episode of Wise the Dome TV. Today, I have a very, very special guest on a very, very important topic. And today, my guest is Dr. John Aden, who holds a doctorate in history with a focus on Africa. Also, a former Fulbright fellow who conducted research in Mali and you speak a second language too, correct?
Yeah, I read French, but I also speak Bambara. Wow. Which is, most people may know it as Bambara. Mm-hmm. That's a language spoken in Mali. Wow. One of the languages spoken in the Mali Empire.
Wow, that's
so.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. That's amazing. And as you see, we have a wonderful scholar with us here today. And today we're going to be talking about Ivan van Sertima's "They Came Before Columbus." And before we get started, I know some of you will probably be in your feelings a little bit, but we have to keep things, we're keeping it scholarly here, and evidence is evidence, right? And, and even then we're going to show that a lot of the points that are being made in the pretendian movement, they're not even being made in Van Sertima's book, They Came Before Columbus. So, we're going to get into a lot of those things. But I would like to ask you, Dr. Aden, as a
ask my friends.
I did not mean to do that. My, what did I just do there?
I know.
Whoops. How far did I
Some of you will probably be in your feelings a little bit. We're keeping it scholarly.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So the one thing I did want to say is I'm not a fan of the name calling. I think I mentioned this before. So I'm not co-signing here like the use of the names like pretendian. I don't like that personally. I think it's not the best thing to do to undermine people's, what people kind of like maybe believe at a certain point in time, or perhaps even believe outright, because that's the kind of line of study they've gone down. So I just don't like that phrase pretending. And one of the main reasons I don't like it is because it seems to be it's like, I think as a community, Black people seem to have these names that only apply to other Black people, So if there's no white equivalent of pretendian, and I just find, and it's like, well, if you're not going to turn around and call them respectfully a lot of those $5 Indians pretendians, then we shouldn't use it for ourselves. So therefore, I think we should just not use those kind of derogatory terms. That's just my personal point of view. But I'll let it go.
Yeah, I mean, I get what you're saying with that, and like from an American perspective, it is a little bit different from the UK perspective, just because of the ethnic tension between like FBAs and like African immigrants and Caribbean immigrants. But as far as like the nature, and I'm saying this as somebody who uses that term from time to time, especially when dealing with trolls, right? There is a time and place, to kind of like throw shots and, pot shots. And there's also a time and place to be academic. So I'm going to try to avoid using those terms during this live.
Oh, no, I appreciate that. Thank you very much. And I wasn't actually saying that. I actually forgot that you used that term. It's just one of those things. So as soon as he said it, it was a little bit of a trigger to me. So yeah, I appreciate that.
Here, and evidence is evidence, right? And and even then, we're going to show that a lot of the points that are being made in the pretendian movement, they're not even being made in Van Sertima's book that came before Columbus. So, we're going to get into a lot of those things. But I would like to ask you, Dr. Aden.
I'd also add that that's not really a point of critique to say that, well, the points that are being made by a certain community aren't even made in the book. So I don't understand. I don't know if that was a critique to say, well, the claims are illegitimate because they're not in a certain book. That's kind of a very, those simplistic kind of view from, I'm always very, very kind of aware when people try to oversimplify people's discourse and arguments as well. It's
an avatar, because, people of all backgrounds in this space, they'll use, Van Sertima's book as an avatar, kind of in a similar way that Christians use the Bible, but many Christians haven't really read the Bible. So a lot of people, when they're attacking, those who believe in a Black Aboriginal identity as opposed to an African identity, they see attacking Ivan van Sertima's work as attacking the foundation of that movement. When it's actually not true. Like if you read, Ivan van Sertima's interactions with his critics, and as well as if you're familiar with the general frameworks that exist within academia, it's actually the American diseducation system and American scholars themselves that are the root of a lot of these pretending ideologies. And we're going to get into that a little bit further, but that's a key point that we have to remember.
And I think on that point, a lot of this just roots back to the whole ideology behind the fact that Africans were incapable, because that's the one overriding message that I got, and I don't want to do too much of a spoiler, but this overriding message that Africans are incapable of technology. Africans were incapable of travel beyond the African coastlines. Africans were just incapable. And I don't think people realize how manufactured and fabricated that line of thinking is. But I'll leave it at that for now.
How North Atlantic it is.
Absolutely.
As a PhD in history with a focus on Africa, someone who has spent years, months, and days studying our history on the continent, what do you think about the popularity of what I call this pretendian movement, where some of our people are denying being of African descent.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's wild. I think
I want to just jump in as well on the phrasing of the questionnaire, which points to what you said earlier, Kamji, versus that.
Yeah.
What he talked about is the fact that these people deny being of African descent. And I think that is one of the key critiques. So it's almost like they're arguing past us here in some ways, because it's more about them saying, oh, you're denying. I think people are doing that in America, is what you're saying, totally denying any connection to any direct connection to Africa, correct?
Yeah, for ethnocentric reasons, for tribalist reasons.
Yeah.
Honest piece is this doesn't happen anywhere else in the Americas, not in the Caribbean, not in Brazil, like all over Central and South America. They're Afro-descended people, and they know they're from Africa. Like it's not, and some of it maybe has to do with the nature and the kind of slavery that was practiced in North America, but you don't see this in Jamaica. Jamaicans know, they know where they come from, right? So, yeah.
I find that as a bit of a straw man argument there as well. That was one of the things that got my back up when I heard him say that. It's kind of like, oh, well, we don't see this in other diaspora groups. I'm just like, well, there are many different reasons for that. So if I was to give my feedback from my lines of inquiry in this subject, I would say, first of all, you have completely different origin stories. You're talking about one colony that was established by directly from the British Isles, and another colony that was established initially by the Spanish, the Portuguese, then finally by the British, who kind of like took over. Also the lines of transport or alleged transport from transatlantic to the Caribbean, or transatlantic to the Caribbean to the Americans, the dates that these transports or alleged transports took place. So even if you're going on the mainstream narrative, these are two populations with very, very different origin stories. So you can't, and obviously many people would argue that the Caribbean story is one that's a little bit less obfuscated. They had different dates of abolition, they had different uprisings in terms of the slave uprisings. So you've just got two very, very different stories, and I think euphemizing diaspora groups in that way is not very helpful, because I think you get much more complete picture when you treat the various South American groups. I'm talking about the Black populations, the various North American Black populations, and the various Caribbean Black populations, with the individualities that their stories deserve.
Yeah, and I would also add, to piggyback on that, within North America, there is a very heavily documented history of so-called Native Americans, the 5 civilized tribes who enslaved Africans, who trafficked Africans illegally, who bought them from, slave auctions, enslaved Africans. So you actually do have many, Black Americans, African Americans, with ancestors who are documented as Cherokee, as Chickasaw, as Seminole, as Creek. And that's real history, that they're Cherokee freedmen, Choctaw freedmen. But the kicker is that they were enslaved by the civilized tribes. They weren't necessarily pre-Columbian in that sense. So because a lot of people in America, in North America, have that history, it's a pretty easy jump to go from there to we were the original Native Americans.
And it's interesting because essentially what you're talking about there is, and I'm not gonna chime too much in this because I've just looked on my desk and I can't find my copy of They Came Before Columbus. I don't know where it is, it might be downstairs, but I wanted to have it on my lap as we were going through this kind of just flick through. But I was gonna say the second generation, for want of a better word, story is one that's very much accepted when it comes to non-Black, I'm gonna say quote unquote Native Indians or Native Americans. Yeah. So the idea of being a second generation, the idea of being, well, my ancestry, I'm white, but I've got one native ancestor or two native ancestors, but I still get wholly accepted as being of native ancestry. Whereas if you flip it the other way around, and it's like, well, I'm black and I come from that kind of like secondary ancestry, like you've just mentioned there, and there'll be no acceptance of your nativeness.
And there's a reason why. There's a deeper reason why. The reason why is because after, and I'm specifically speaking in the North American context, after the Civil War and after the emancipation of African slaves, many of these freedmen, they were supposed to be granted citizenship, land allotment of the civilized tribes. They would have gotten access to casino concessions. But if they were allowing that, then a lot of the Africans that they had enslaved previously and their descendants would be eligible for a lot of the wealth that they wanted to keep for themselves. So it's a very vitriolic response because in a sense, it would kind of unseat the racial hierarchy that existed in America if the descendants of Africans enslaved by these groups who definitively mixed with these groups were able to get, reparations in that sense. Yeah. So that's kind of why it exists in the American context.
Yeah, absolutely. And then also that brings us on to the whole discussion of the paper genocide, which is a very real thing as well. And I recall multiple conversations I've had with people who are relative experts in the topic of the constantly changing consensus category.
Yeah. Yeah, I had a conversation with because Trill Black, he had London MC on his channel. Yeah. They did a live, which I actually learned a lot from that live. I learned a lot, but I had some disagreements in the sense of, there are some individuals who were Native American who were reclassified, as Negro, as Black by Plecker because of the mixing that occurred, and he didn't necessarily want, the mixed descendants of Native Americans and Africans to be able to claim indigenous status, right? Yeah. So that definitely happened. However, I don't necessarily agree with, and others, like London would probably disagree with this. I don't think it was like a widespread changing of like the original natives, into Negro.
Where I'd just be careful, personally, not for you to say. Well, I would say that I think it was a lot more widespread than people acknowledge. I would even give an individual name like Plucker because I had a interview with Dr. Nell Irvin Painter, the writer of The History of White People, and she speaks about the fact that the census categories would change every decade. So this isn't something that was done once every 100 years or something. This is like literally every decade, and they would change the categories. So you have to imagine it was very easy to take perhaps a group or population, and this isn't universal across America, but I'd imagine there would have been states that had higher proportions of people who were Afro-presenting, but were of native ancestry. And then you go into one of those states, and obviously with America being, having its white supremacy laws that it's trying to push through, it says, okay, so in this state, we're going to have maybe 3 categories, which will be like, native. I'm just throwing these out there, by the way. These aren't actual ones, but let's say this year it's going to be native, colored, and Negro and white. Okay. And then all of the people who are kind of like dark presenting, depending on who they want to classify, they'll allow some to present to be native. Or you kind of got like a Chinesey look to you, but then some really dark skinned ones, they go, no, you need to put colored down. But then in the next decade, colored disappears. And now all of a sudden, the only options are Negro, Negro native. And all of a sudden, you've had this disappearance. So all those people who are colored are now on the new census being classified as being Negro. And there is strong evidence that this happened. So I had an interview with like a Dr. Anita Wills as well. She's got people actually in her, she's not a doctor. Anita Wills, who's a genealogist and a researcher. She's got people in her actual lineage who she can trace the reclassification when they were changing one thing to the other and one thing to the other. Yeah, so
and London did as well. And the reason why I don't necessarily go too deep in that direction is because obviously, I respect people's individual genealogy. and what they can record themselves. And
yeah,
it's just something that requires a lot more, delicacy and analysis on behalf of like Africana scholars, right? So to me, it's open to possibility, but I don't necessarily make declarative statements on that point.
Yeah. Shout out to Wise the Dome TV. I think I just saw him comment in the chat as well.
Yeah, shout out to Wise.
Shout out to you, brother. You're very welcome here. I did say earlier, we're not critiquing you personally, but we're gonna express kind of our views on this particular interview.
And you could put it at like 1.25 or 1.5 if you want.
And
should I speed it up? Yeah, I don't think we'll get through this today, but let me speed it up a bit.
Because it's like the meat and potatoes is really the middle part.
Does he speak fast? I can't remember. I speak slow, so it's always worthwhile speeding up my videos, but I don't know how fast this brother speaks. Let me put that
some of it, and I would just say, I mean, I'm sure we'll get into it a little more, but this is a reflection on the poor quality of America's public educational system.
Absolutely.
And I would be remiss if I didn't say, like, once desegregation happened, 33,000 African-American administrators and teachers lost their jobs, mostly administrators, right? So it's kind of a hidden story in relationship to like what we were pursuing, our ancestors or elders were pursuing with desegregation. There were black school superintendents and, the pre-civil rights era. Well, civil rights a long era, but before the civil rights legislation in the King era, right? So we lost all those people.
Right.
Those people were clear about our ancestry, and they cared very deeply about educating black children and the black community. So that wasn't an accident. When desegregation unfolds,
I would just like to jump on that point as well about saying those people were clear about our ancestry, because I feel like this is a point that he somewhat contradicts later on in the video when he talks about the fact that, he basically is very dismissive and very rubbishing of people's personal dialogues, their personal genealogy. We just both express that we respect, and I've always expressed that to my community as well. My community know this from the very start of my channel. I always said, listen, don't disrespect your elders. Your genealogy will tell you infinitely more than your genetics will, and people do not realize this. Your genealogy always trumps your genetics, always. Okay, so you have to understand your genealogy always trumps your genetics. Genetics can cross over. Genetics are diffuse. They always will be diffuse. So that means there's always going to be people who exist in populations that don't look genetically like the population that they've grown up in. That's just an unavoidable fact. People think that all black people are E1B1A or something like that. It's like, no, you might have a majority or a large proportion, but it's not all. There are some that have just got random Asian, some that have random European, but they are every bit as native as you are, every bit as integrated. So that's why you must always make sure that you get your genealogy. And when I hear people just kind of like rubbish people's genealogical stories or tales of their ancestry, it does grind me the wrong way. And saying that, oh, we had it right, just kind of disregards all of the research and all of the researchers that have written books since segregation to now, and that just kind of rubbed me up the wrong way a little bit.
Yeah, and I'll just add simply to that, genetic ancestry is not the same as genealogical ancestry. Many times your genealogically identifiable ancestors do not pass down their genes to you. And that's just kind of how genetics works. So like to discard genealogy is very pseudoscientific, which I don't know if I think he rubbished it, but I think later on he kind of like breaks down like the importance of genealogical testimonies. Like later,
I think only if it goes hand in hand with the mainstream narrative, though. That's my issue. So it's kind of like that's a partial acceptance. If your grandparents said this, they were right, but if they said that, they're crazy.
Yeah, that's
you understand. That's what I don't like.
Yeah, you have to reflect that for sure.
Yeah. So, and also I would just say, people saying that genetics and genealogy go hand in hand. I said that's all well and good, but that won't be the case until essentially we've genetically tested the entire population, the entire human population, not the percentage that's been tested at the moment. And on top of that, we've also tested, at least, a good proportion of ancient genetics, which we're nowhere even near. We've had a drop in the ocean. So people get this idea that we really understand population movement through genetics at the moment, and take it from somebody who has done a lot of study in this area. We understand nothing. Okay. we understand nothing. People don't understand
anthropology by far.
Absolutely. But anyway, let me let it play.
A lot of white school superintendents just fired the black, school principals, etc., as black people are trying to move into, to integrate white institutions. And then you got white flight.
Yeah.
So, white people flee those institutions anyway because they had no intention of going to school with the likes of us.
Right.
And so when they fled in the public schools, they gutted the tax base, and that killed all the funding for schools. So then they became inner city schools, right?
Right.
But so it's, it's a part of America's story.
True.
It's all bound up in how real estate, redlining, like all of it's connected. So we end up with, people of African descent who in the United States who don't believe they're of African descent. Now, the other pieces I'm sure like your audience is familiar with. There's some people who feel a really intense amount of shame at having the idea that their ancestors were enslaved and were subjected to these horrific brutalities by Europeans and European Americans. I look at it differently. I mean, do you realize how hardy the people had to have been to have survived sometimes 100 or 200 mile trek from the interior of West Africa to the coast, and then survive the Middle Passage and all the diseases, and then survive everything that happened after that?
Right.
Like, hardiest people in the world. Like, so when people say, we are our ancestors' wildest dreams, like, I know it's a bit of a meme, but no, like, that's real.
Right.
That's real. And so for me, if you're talking about survivor mode, there's no group of people on this whole planet who has had to survive something so horrific as our ancestors had to.
Absolutely.
So for me, it's more of a point of pride.
Yeah.
I got no hate to the point he just made there. I think it was actually well stated. I want to give a shout out to Nata. Thank you very much, Nata, for your 100 Swedish krona. Much appreciated, and it's glad to have you here on this chat as well. Also, I wanted to just remind everybody we're here. We're gonna have a good time today, I feel, but I just gotta remind people periodically that Camgiverse's channel has been demonetized. A link to his Substack is in the chat, and I would just ask you all to just click that link in the Substack, join, give him some fans, give him some followers, help him to, continue to provide his valuable research to the community. Let me let it go from there.
Sir, I also posted my Cash App in the private message.
Okay, and he's also posted a Cash App. Do you want to send me that? Oh, have you messaged it to me so I can add it to that banner?
Yeah, on the StreamYard private message.
Okay, let me just quickly pull that up. Sorry, guys, give me 2 seconds. I want to add that to the banner on the StreamYard. Sorry, just give me 1 second, guys.
Yeah, Smelly saying why. Well, I mean, the reason why it was bogus, like they basically accused it of using certain tools for mass production and, it being inauthentic and all this type of stuff. And it's actually part of a larger wave where, channels have been attacked, African centered channels. So, it's really, really unfortunate. But at the same token, like we want to build outside of it. And I've been really thankful to those who have supported thus far, in terms of the Patreon, in terms of the Substack, which I'm getting, fired up, as well as.
That's not it.
Yeah, it's trying to put the Cash App up. And if anybody wants, like, if you have a request of an article or a video or anything that you want me to talk about, Cash App is an easy way to reach me, or you could send me a private message via Patreon, and I greatly appreciate that.
Superb. Thank you.
On the planet who can say that?
No.
Not on the whole planet.
Yeah,
so,
I know, I agree 100%. That's how I look at it as well. I mean, it's a source of pride for me to know that our ancestors went through that. It's never been a source of shame. It's always been like, look at how resilient our ancestors were. Look what the things that they left us with, the things that have been passed down from generation to generation in our families, and that were able to survive all of that horror that they went through. Like you said, it's not a source of shame for me, So before we get into the specifics of They Came Before Columbus, all right, I think most people have read the book or at least heard about the book. But can you, before we get into the specifics of the book, can you tell the people who may not be familiar with it what the premise of They Came Before Columbus is, and maybe a little bit about Ivan van Sertima himself?
Yeah, so Ivan van Sertima was a scholar from Guyana, and he became world renowned when he published this book that came before Columbus in 1976. It was really at the end of the year. I think it was published on November 12th, 1976. And it was published on November 1st. There was a book called America BC that was published by a white professor named Barry Fell. Actually, he was British, I believe, Barry Fell. And he was at Yale, or I think it's at Harvard. And he was a marine biologist. And so the books came out like 1, 2, right? And it's important. I'm glad you asked this question, Brother Rakeem, because understanding the moment is really important. In the 1970s, much like today, anybody could publish a book.
Right.
And there wasn't a lot of, peer review, the way it's understood now, was different then in the academy where scholars worked. So you had, it's almost, I'm saying similar to today because you got Amazon self-publishing. Anybody can publish a book, right?
Right.
I think one of the books that's really popular in
I feel like this is one of his one of the arguments that he continually refers to is this idea that academic rigor has improved since the book was written. And I just kind of see that as a bit of a straw man argument. Because kind of like, well, are you saying that we just discard all the books written before 1980? Basically, just throw them away, just burn them.
Fallacy. It's a novelty fallacy. The idea that just because something's newer, it means it's correct.
Yeah. And but it's even just the idea that, his doctorate don't mean nothing because he gained it at this time. But it's kind of like, well, then I've heard these arguments raised, against even, when I've referenced something before. Oh, it's really old now. It's like, okay, but it was still research and it was still done. And there's still valuable primary and secondary data there, even if you don't agree with the conclusions. How can you just turn around and say, oh, well, everything's better now. There's so much more rigor. So everything that people wrote before a certain date was complete rubbish. It's kind of like, well, what did you study from then? What did you produce your dissertation from? Everything, your peers? No, people will be producing, their studies, their dissertations, their research, their thesis will come from a collection of works over a collection and a span of time. So it just seems like a really invalid argument to me,
Well, he's trying to basically attack the foundations of the work. And, just from listening to, Dr. Aden, it doesn't appear that he considers Van Sertima a part of the Africana framework, right? Because a lot of his criticisms are coming from the Americanist angle. So and y'all in the comments, you're going to hear a lot about frameworks in my conversation about this, because the epistemology that these scholars are using is very, very important. The different inferences that they're using are very, very important. And the implications, not just the evidence, but the implications of the evidence on the framework is of the utmost importance, as we continue to listen to this.
Let's go.
Latin American studies on Amazon's list is When Rocks Cry Out.
Yes.
Which is another pseudo-historical, pseudo-archaeological work. It's like the #1 freaking work in Amazon in Latin American studies. The dude's got no degree, no languages, he's just spouting stuff, right? So the moment was similar, but there was no internet. And I always highlight that, which I'm sure we'll get into, but the internet and personal computing access changed the way scholars work and the access to information they could actually acquire. Before that, you were in a library with a physical card catalog doing research, right? But so Van Sertima is important because I won't deny his importance. Like the work's publication is significant. I was a graduate student in undergrad student in 1988 when I first read it, and that kind of sent me on an odyssey. There were other works that were being published at the same time or around the same time as Van Sertima's work, like, Chancellor Williams' Destruction of Black Civilization, all of Dr. Ben's works, then eventually like Anthony Browder started publishing. But there's a group of people, also Asa Hilliard, very Egyptocentric, right? And they published works. And what's fascinating about all of these people, for the most part, Dr. John Henry Clark is in a category unto himself. I see him completely differently than I see these other scholars. But, and I really call them grassroots intellectuals for the most part. Now, why they were is complicated. And, they were not allowed often access into the upper echelons of university systems because they were people of color, they were Black people, and segregation was a thing. Right. And so that's like, I gotta make sure I put a pin in that, because otherwise we won't be capturing the moment effectively for them. And that's like really, really important to capture. And also, like, I'm gonna just pull aside for a second. You asked me, what was his claim? I want to work toward that. So in order to become like, someone certified to write and talk about, say, Egyptology as a science, you had to know like multiple languages. You had to know French, you had to know German. Then within Egyptian languages themselves, you also had to know hieroglyphics, and then you had to know hieratic and demotic, which are two cursive forms of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, right? And then you had to know Arabic. You need to know German.
This argument here also, I have a slight issue with, once again, because first of all, I've spoken to a number of PhDs, PhD candidates, Black ones, obviously, who have all faced immense, obstacles, immense blockage, immense, friction trying to obtain their PhD. I was speaking to one, I interviewed one just recently, Dr. Onyeka Kanubia, who had to do his dissertation 3 times in 3 different institutions, and not because his work or his research was insufficient, but simply because
right now.
Well, there you go. Consistent. I was speaking to, I literally will be speaking to, I'll be posting an interview soon on the channel, a guy who wanted to do an Egyptology PhD, was denied it, and in the end he settled for an archaeology because they wouldn't let him specialize in Egyptology because he's Black. They just wouldn't let him specialize, so he had to settle for archaeology, and then he just kind of like loaded his research with ancient Egypt to kind of like get that exposure. But this is the kind of obstacles that are faced, and also even those in in America who the HBCUs who eventually some of them would start to offer those kinds of qualifications, and how those were even looked upon in wider academia, the level of respect, whether that they are given or denied. So I think just having that balance and acknowledging that difficulty that our scholars face, I think that goes some way, rather than just making this idea. I know he's not explicitly saying that, but making this idea that, hey, look, if you wanted to get the qualification, you got to go this route and then you'd get that. It's kind of like, well, that's all well and good. But W.E.B. Du Bois spoke about in the bloody late, in the early 20th century, spoke about being blocked, from doing his Egypt, and his colleagues being blocked from doing Egyptology, So this has been going on for 150 years now, at least, probably longer.
Yeah, and the reason why I made the previous comment about just the framework is that just from the conversation, it appears, that Dr. Aden is kind of slighting like the African-centered space for the lack of rigor, as opposed to like wanting to promote more rigorous methodologies within the framework itself. So there are probably ideological disagreements that he may have with somebody like, Molefi Asante or somebody like Amma Mazama. But even at the same token, in the very era that he's speaking of, in the 70s, that's when you have the UNESCO Symposium with scholars like Sheikh Anta Diop and Theophilo Benga and scholars like Kizerbo, and Diang. So like at the very same era that he's talking about, African scholars were able to prove the Africanity and the blackness of the Pharaonic civilization in the light of a lot of the, interlocutors from Europe and the people who were against them. So like, if it kind of speaks volumes as to where he's coming from, and no shade, but from my analysis of this work, and particularly the heavy influence of Americana scholars like Coe and Deal and Cyphers, which we're going to get into later on, they have shaped the majority of the orientation around this conversation. And the conversation is to just dispute, deny, and just dispose of any African-centered idea that opposes, the supremacy of Columbus and North Atlantic technologies connecting ancient people. And that's just bunk. It's just fraudulent, for lack of a better word.
I mean, the fact that to me, and this is going to sound controversial, but you know me, I don't really care. I'm going to say what I think. Even the fact that we still use Columbine and pre-Columbine as though it's some measure of human achievement, that just speaks to A, Eurocentric arrogance, and B, our own ignorance. If we're going to continue to buy into that as though it's some flagship of human achievement, that the fact that people can't actually fathom a possibility that the Europeans were not first to make that traverse, and actually it wasn't even that big a deal. And I've spoken about this, you just have to look on the old maps to see that the ocean we call the Atlantic Ocean was called the Ethiopic Sea. And they were very, very well aware. In fact, it was called for a long time, it was called the Western Ocean due to its orientation to Africa. So, the fact that people are, still arguing this, and actually we shouldn't even be using Columbine or Columbian as though it's some kind of a milestone in terms of navigability around the world. It's just something that I think this is it's the overloading of Eurocentric jargon in our language that makes us center everything around the European continent when actually we shouldn't be doing that anyway.
No, not at all. 100% agree.
Yeah. Let's carry on.
Right. So when they talk about like a Renaissance man, when they would write about this type of person in the 1910s or the 40s or the 30s, what they meant, or in the 19th century, what they meant was someone who'd studied those classical languages and knew them at a certain level of depth. Because when you walked in to look at a collection, you needed to be able to understand like the liner note, what we call the metadata around whatever you were looking at. Now, I'll just say, like, as an aside, we haven't talked about this part, but when I was about to graduate from college, I did a summer research internship at the University of Chicago in Hyde Park. Great university, right? And I was at the Oriental Institute Museum, which is the #1 Egyptological center in the United States for the study of classical ancient Egypt. So, and I started learning hieroglyphs there, and I had a research project, which was about whether mummies and melanin could be determined in their skin, etc. And the science was nowhere developed like it is now, which is another important point, right? So what did Van Sertima claim? He claimed that Africans had immigrated or traveled to North America and the Western Hemisphere prior to Columbus, right? And the kind of standard wisdom to that point was that no people of African descent had traveled to this hemisphere before 1492 when Columbus went on his voyages.
Yeah.
And so he claimed that. Now, he also claimed as additional pieces that, I'll start in chronological order, that Nubians had sailed into the Western Hemisphere from the Mediterranean, from ancient Egypt, and then they'd sailed all the way here, settled, and built civilizations. And they were like the seed for certain civilizations. And then he also argued that West Africa was likely from the Mali Empire.
That's not what he claimed. His argument was more contact as opposed to seeding. So you can keep going.
I think, would you agree that he said it sound, at least my understanding from Van Sertima's argument was not for seeding, but it was for seeding the I want to say the civilization, for want of a better word, the kind of like the royal element. Because I think his line of thinking was that the Olmec heads were the rulers. Yeah, so the Africans came and they kind of ruled and established something before. Is that
what he was saying was that there's contact. So like he put it in 3 different modes, particularly the Olmec civilization. So he was dealing with the Africans, the Native Americans, and various Mediterranean groups. And according to Van Sertima, the indigenous Americans were the core of the groups, and then like Africans and various Mediterranean groups migrated in and had significant influence in the BC era specifically. So that's kind of what, but he didn't claim that like Africans came in and like built the whole thing. That's not what he claimed.
Thank you for clarifying that. I just want to give a shout out as well to JJW56, who's sent $10. Appreciate you, brother. It says, or sister, I don't know. He said, do you agree that Olmecs were indigenous to Mexico or surrounding areas? I believe if they had sailed from Africa, they clearly would have left some marker stating that they sailed from the east. Well, it's difficult to say because how much have we deciphered?
And there's different types of Olmec. Olmec just means rubber people, and that's getting a little bit deeper. I don't know if we're gonna have time to go into that today, but it's yes and no to that question.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I'm going to highlight at this point as well is my firm belief that we have to do away with our oversimplification of global populations, particularly when we're dealing with continents.
Yeah,
and I think this is a residual impact of the slave trade, of racism, and of global caste systems, where everybody thinks one landmass equals one type of people. And I think it's that kind of binary thinking that has people in this state where they're trying to work out what was the X, Y, and Z race. They can't fathom the fact that the same kind of diversity that we witness in certain parts of the world today existed in different parts of the world. It's just like, well, the Native Americans had to all be Chinese, or they had to all be Australoid, or they had to all be, African looking. And it's kind of like, actually, there's a whole arse continent that been there for, thousands of years. It's very likely you would have witnessed similar to diversity to the kind of diversity you see now, minus perhaps the Indo-European. But that's just something that I don't think people can kind of get their head around. And when you think about the world in that way, things make a lot more sense than the kind of diversity that, when they pull up a Lucia, for instance, and she is African presenting, but directly African presenting, and then you pull up an Olmec remains and they're slightly more Australoid. That should help you to make sense of that, because bear in mind what remains of these civilizations. It's not like we're pulling up car park loads of hundreds of thousands of populations. When we haven't got populations full of bones to test, genetics to test, ancestry to test, anthropological measurements. A lot of the time when a lot of these broad sweeping conclusions are made, it's being made on the finding of a single individual, or a single set of bones, or maybe a couple, or maybe a single family. It's not that much to go by. Imagine if they, I just explain to people, imagine 2,000 years from now, there's a big cataclysm, World War III, we all get wiped out by nuclear war because of Trump. Yeah. It's a possibility. Don't shoot the messenger. So 2,000 years later, the small part of the world that exists, they find bones, but there's not many. Most of them have been destroyed or degraded over time, this, that, and the other. And they find 5 skeletons in London. Okay? They find 5 skeletons in London of our time period. Are they going to be able to paint a realistic picture of what London was from those 5 bones that they pull up? Impossible. It's literally impossible. Do you understand? Even in Nigeria, let's say, Nigeria gets flattened and they find 24 bones, 24 people. Yeah. from those 24 people that they pull up, are they going to be able to paint a realistic picture of what Nigeria is?
No.
Not even close.
Not even close.
Not even close. And this is what people do not realize, that we are going off such scant data when it comes to ancient anything, ancient anthropology and ancient genetics. That's what people are kind of missing.
Yeah, and this sentence at the very end, like, there's an Aztec scholar, me and Trill Black have posted about him, Fernando de Alva Itzel Xochitl, and he actually stated that, you know, the Olmecs were dark-skinned with woolly hair, and they migrated from the sea from the east. So there's your reference if you're looking for that 16th to 17th century reference.
There you go. That's a good one. Thank you for sharing.
Yep.
Higher. There was a king, Abu Bakari II, claimed that he had sailed across the Atlantic based on a few written accounts that had been collected like fourth or fifth hand, which we'll get into. And so he claimed that his party of, you know, which it was alleged maybe 2,000 boats or 4,000 boats sailed into the Atlantic. And then Van Sertima argued they founded the Olmec civilization. And so he looked at the art in Olmec civilization.
Sorry, go on.
So like this gets into the polemical nature of the conversation, because not only did Ivan van Sertima never state that, but even the critics in the CA, you know, Current Anthropology Forum in 1997, Hazlitt Vieira, Montellano, Cyphers, Coe, Richard Beale, they don't even say that they said that. What they're stating, and these are the critics against Ivan van Sertima in Robbing Native American Cultures, the article that they released, they're saying that, you know, Ivan van Sertima believed that the Malians in the 14th century sailed to Mesoamerica and left some large degrees of influence. And according to the critics against Van Sertima, these influences were too late to have like a founding or foundational impact on Mesoamerican civilization. So those are the critics. But Van Sertima specifically, you know, especially if you read not only his 1976 text, but 1987 African Presence in Early America, which was an addendum to They Came Before Columbus, and then his 1998 text, Early America Revisited, he's dealing with the peopling of America in waves from the Ramesside period of 1200 BC, even going all the way back to the Black Australoids of the Paleolithic era, down to the Christian era or the current era in the Malians. And what he's stating in the text is that there is some cultural diffusion that could be observed between the Malians of Abubakar in the 14th century and various, you know, Mesoamerican civilizations. But he never stated that they founded the Olmecs, and a lot of the polemical attacks against the contact model use this chronological argument, which is just unfounded. He didn't say that. His critics didn't say that. So like, this is the part where it's like, okay, if we're being scholarly, we actually have to go off of what the scholars argued and not what you think they said.
Thank you. I'm just going to pause, hold the thought, and feel free to talk for 1 minute as I quickly have to run and do a quick errand. Okay,
for sure.
You have a minute.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that, like, again, you know, a lot of times, you know, with these conversations, it kind of gets wrapped up into certain beliefs that people have about the data and just certain things that people want to believe. But, you know, I don't think it's accurate to put Sertima in the same space as Barry Fell. You know, I don't think that that's legitimate, because Sertima is somebody who spoke at the Smithsonian in the United States at the quinticentennial of, you know, the voyage. I don't know if it was Columbus's voyage, the quinticentennial of that voyage. That would have been 1992. So he spoke at that ceremony, and he basically referenced his work, you know, his two works, and They Came Before Columbus and the addendum that was released, you know, in African Presence in Early America. And the important thing about the addendum is the fact that, like, that actually coincides with a lot of what Americanists believe, from Ann Cyphers to Michael Coe to Richard Deal, you know, even Erwin Palmer, you know, von Wuthenau. He spoke about Erwin Palmer in the sense that when these scholars, when these Americana scholars see a Black looking person, in ancient American records before Columbus, they're more comfortable with saying that it's a Melanesian or that it's an Asian migrant, and they absolutely do not want to say that it came from Africa directly. So like that's literally the same argument as the aforementioned, nativist FBA type groups who want to use like Pacific Islanders to show that, the original people of America weren't African. They literally have the same ideology. So it's not African-centered scholars or even Sertima that's, promoting these groups. It's actually mainstream American diseducation that's doing that job. So, I just find it interesting. Like when you really read, like with a fine-tooth comb, what Sertima and his critics stated, it reveals their epistemological biases. And it also reveals the polemical nature of these conversations, as opposed to like having like a legitimate scholarly discourse.
I almost feel like having legitimate scholarly discourse about this particular subject is probably the most difficult one there is. It fires up so much.
Yeah,
it fires up so much bile and so much, people who just want to, argue and belittle and to say you're wrong, and people get really passionate about it. And to some extent, I do understand it, but to another extent, no, I understand it, but I also struggle to deal with it, if that makes sense. It's like people are so resistant to anything. It's like they're so. Going back to you, actually, let me ask you a question before I hit play again. Yeah. As someone who's in America, as an American, there seems to be a connection with this topic and the idea that people hate themselves if they even explore it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean that is because of the amount of attacks against African history. There's a lot of individuals who state that if you give any type of information that's outside of mainstream Americanist narratives or Africanist narratives, then you're just trying to promote a glorious picture of yourself outside of like the plantation boundaries that has been set for Black people. And, just off the rip, I don't necessarily think that's bad, because people talk about romanticization, but literally throughout American culture and probably British culture, you have a romanticization of the West, a romanticization of classical Greek, Roman literature, the playwrights of Shakespeare, like et cetera, et cetera. And nobody bats an eye, like when the Queen of Charlotte is romanticized, but then they bat an eye when it's depicted as a Black woman, because they absolutely do not want that to happen. Right.
Yeah.
So it's just like you need to know your place, and you need to not even step outside of the plantation and find, glorious aspects of African history that, should be acceptable for everybody. So the idea that there's some type of self-hatred, I don't think that that's legitimate. I think that anybody could have inquiry, even within the academy. Like you have scholars with a variety of different religious views, Muslim scholars, Mormon scholars, Hindu scholars, atheists, feminists. You have people with so many different ideological backgrounds, but they're allowed to engage and articulate their views as long as if they have a rigorous approach and they have a good framework, et cetera, et cetera. But people are uncomfortable with Black people doing the same because it upsets the racial hierarchy that exists within these spaces.
Yeah, exactly. That's very well put. I'm going to carry on playing now.
And said, well, these look like brown people. And he was like, these are Africans. And they're the ones who founded this civilization. Right. So that's basically what Van Sertima claimed, that he used a lot of what we would call like phenotypic circumstantial evidence to allege.
Sorry, was you going to say something there?
I'm just like, the way that he's simplifying it is like kind of, it's troublesome, because within the 3 volumes of books that I mentioned, he definitely didn't just look at phenotype. Like, there's so many pieces of evidence that he looks at. Like you could look at Wayne, the scholar, the Olmec archaeologist who supported him in a letter to the Smithsonian and a letter to the New York Times. So like, you can disagree with Van Sertima. There's no problem with that. But just to say that he was solely focused on phenotype is definitively false. That's not true. It's absolutely untrue.
I would agree with that as well. I think the evidence is, well, it's strong enough. Was this his doctoral thesis?
Sertima? No. It wasn't, because he was a lexicographer. He was a Swahili lexicographer. That was his background.
Yes, yeah.
I'm actually not sure, because I know he went to Rutgers University and he's like in the Rutgers Hall of Fame, but I'd have to get some more information about like the background of his dissertation. I don't know off the top of my head.
Okay, cool. Yeah, let's carry on playing now.
To claim, I'm going to call it claim, not prove, but to try to prove anyway, that these people were of African descent. So he looked at the Olmec heads and he said, well, they have thick lips, big noses, and their hair looks like braids. These must be Africans, right? So that was his basic claim.
Right.
Now, for evidence, he relied largely on Europeans. So
Leo Wiener for one, right?
Yeah, Leo Wiener for one, who was Austrian, I believe. Alexander von Wertenau. These were people who had read the work of a man named Jose Melgar y Serrano. Melgar y Serrano, I think at that time, people in Latin America had two last names, right? So this guy, Melgar y Serrano, was the one who first encountered in the modern era the Olmec heads. And so that was his claim to fame. So Alexander von Wertenau, Leo Wiener read about him, and they said, oh, these are clearly African features. They called them Ethiopian, which was, in the late 19th century, in the 1880s and 90s, early 20th century. I think Leo Wiener published in 1921. This was how they wrote about Africans. Now, of course, it's really super important to keep in mind that there's certain standards in the graduate research level academy in the United States today that didn't exist back then. So these people, we would call them armchair anthropologists, which basically means they didn't travel to the place where they were making claims about. They didn't talk to the local experts there. They didn't know the art history. They didn't know the languages, right? They hadn't gone to local archives. So you start adding all of that up, and that's really a profound degree of ignorance about the thing they're talking about. Right. And I just say, like, you use a $10 word, they were pontificating about the stuff that they were just assuming was true. The other thing that they did was, well, if you are familiar with, the work of Johann Blumenbach, this, German who coined Caucasoid, Negroid, Mongoloid, right? And there was a fourth one, I believe. So he was the first person to coin this idea of Caucasian as an identity. And it's a broader part of the European project, the pseudo-historical, pseudo-scientific project to quantify race.
Right.
And so these we call, all historians for the most part, social historians. I don't know anyone who's against this, but.
So, just to jump in there on this, I'm sure when Van Sertima was using, once again, it's this kind of, this idea that he's not allowed to use scholars around him. And he's like, oh, well, he used white scholars. But then if you're turned around, what's he supposed to do? Use the black scholars that don't exist? I don't understand. I don't understand exactly what he's. Sorry,
he's actually he's kind of frozen in time, because they came before Columbus in 1976. Van Sertima did use a preponderance of European scholars, of Western scholars, which, I guess, as you were about to intimate, like if you use black scholars, it's invalid. But then if you use white scholars, it's invalid, right? Like if you use black scholars, you're a crazy Hotep or something. But if you use white scholars, you're using Eurocentrism and Eurocentric impositions. But even then, John Henry Clark actually wrote a review of the book and criticized Van Sertima for not using more African-centered scholars, right? Like Kofi Wangara or Harold Lawrence, right? Like Vang, Cameroonian, anthropologist and theologian. And actually in African presence in early America, Van Sertima included more, black scholars like Sir Francis Drake, St. Drake, and, other scholars of the like. So Van Sertima in his 87 publication, his 1998 publication, actually used more African scholars. And one of the scholars that he used, right, which is a Mexican scholar, Guadarrama, he analyzed the Tatalico remains, which is a Mesoamerican site, and it found that a lot of the cranial morphology, right, I think we went over this on the previous slide with Trill Black, that actually followed, African morphology. And
well, feel free to mention it again, because this is a different channel, so you can repeat yourself as much.
So Vargas Guadarrama is a Mexican scholar, and he analyzed some Tatalico remains. And Tatalico was a site that was a mixture of Olmec migrants as well as like some indigenous people in the region. And he found two types, like a robust type and a glacial type, reflected in Wyszynski, the Polish anthropologist, analysis. And for people who criticize Wyszynski, in his, dictation of African elements among the Olmec remains and among Mesoamerican remains, Guadarrama did a non-metric analysis. So he didn't do racial typology. He was actually, looking at the cladistic elements of a lot of these skulls and skeletal remains in Tadalico. And he found that they were associated with the Dongolan type, quote unquote, or the equatorial type in so-called Ethiopian type. So like he was actually engaging in so-called new archaeology or processual archaeology as opposed to culture historical archaeology of the early 20th century. So the idea that he wasn't up to date with a lot of the anthropological and archaeological methods of his time and researching is not true. That's not true.
And also, I'd add to that as well, even the summary of Blumenbach that he gave is, because obviously this is something that I discussed in a lot of detail with Dr. Nerve and Payne, and that was incorrect because there were 5 types, but not just putting them up on that, that's neither here nor there. He said 4, there's 5 types. But also it's important to note that Blumenbach, as kind of the father of anthropology, there's no evidence in Blumenbach's work that he actually was racist. So he did do the separation or the classification of peoples. So in many ways, he's seen as the person who kind of like originated the anthropological idea of race. But in his 5 classifications, there was no caste, there was no class system. He did believe that the Caucasoid skull was the most beautiful, and that was the reason he included his group into the Caucasoid group, because he thought, oh, well, this is the most gracile skull. But he didn't say all of the other skulls were wrong and were ugly. What's also quite interesting as well, and this was for the people who want to know, if you was to compare the Ethiopian, which is obviously the African, so he had 5. So he had Caucasian, Mongolian, Malayan, American, and Ethiopian. And the 2 ones that are actually most similar are American and Ethiopian, interestingly. So once again, we're going back a few hundred years now. We're going back to, I believe, the 17th, 18th century. And we've got the first anthropologists, and the skulls of the Ethiopians are aligning strongly with the skulls of the Americans. So you can do with that what you will.
It's important that you make that point also, because the same people who will criticize racial typology, I've mentioned this before, when it comes to Africa, particularly Afrikaners, they're perfectly fine with divvying up the African continent. Bantus over here, Mandes over here, Hamido-Semitic or Afro-Asiatic over here, Khoisan over here. They'll do it until the cows come home. So it's not okay when you want to find Africans in pre-Columbian America, so-called, but when you want to divide and just like be against unity on the African continent, all these racial typologies and impositions, especially as it relates to linguistic, are par for the course. And he's going to get into that, further on in the video, of just the dividing lines and the methodologies of tracing origins of vocabulary, which would not be accepted in the historical linguistic space.
Absolutely. I'm going to just quickly read out a super chat from Kalnari. Thank you very much, sir, for your $20. Very much appreciated. He said, I take issue with these type of people who make the rounds on these shows knowing the interviewer is more likely than not underinformed. They never show up in spaces where they could be challenged by other scholars. That's a fair critique. It's a strong critique, but it's a fair critique. So I'm gonna let that one stew for a little bit. Perhaps maybe we could create the forum where we could have the discussion with Dr. Aden. That would be very interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much for that, Kalnari. Let's keep it going.
These are all pseudoscientific racist ideas. Absolutely. And they're labeled and taught like that in grad school by white scholars and scholars from all different backgrounds. So, but at the time, in the middle of the colonial period, Europeans are trying to use pseudoscience to validate their domination of the rest of the planet. And so that meant, if they had hierarchies of civilization and they placed themselves at the top as the most civilized, and the people they placed as uncivilized at the bottom were Africans. And then all the other groups were in between. So the Asians from East Asia, like Chinese culture, was valued very highly by the Europeans because it was a written tradition. I don't hesitate to call it literacy because there's different types of literacy.
Right.
You can be literate in oral.
Just to be clear, Blumenbach didn't make any of those claims that he's saying there as well. Just have to make sure that's being made very clear.
Knowledge, just like you can be literate in written knowledge. And oh, by the way, what happens when you write something down and it's inaccurate or a falsehood and it gets perpetuated across generations? We don't want to talk about that when we talk about how powerful literacy is.
Because they're quick to point that out about oral history, right? Like, what happens if you get something wrong? But what happens if you get something wrong when it's written?
That's right. And the flip side is what happens if it gets something right? So there was an interesting article in I know it's kind of a lightning rod now, but it was published before all the crazy stuff that's unfolding in the moment. There was an article in the Washington Post 2 years ago, maybe, about how Aborigines in Australia had described a moment when a particular star was visible. It's in their oral traditions, but that star hasn't been visible for 14,000 years.
Wow.
So before that, we were like, well, the oldest you can go back in African history is roughly maybe 1,500 years BCE, where you have oral traditions. Because there's 3 levels to orality I can talk about. There's oral tradition. Yeah, definitely I will. Oral tradition can go back. Now, oral tradition is considered when there's 3 levels, right? So oral tradition is often considered, ideas almost in the realm of mythology that describe ancient conversations, and often there are animals involved or there are fish involved. So, in the founding of the city of Bamako, the capital city of Mali, is a great example, right? So the word Bamako is a portmanteau. It's a word combined from 2 other words. And the word Bama means crocodile and the word Ko means speaks. So in Mande, the Mande are the ethnic, the language family that the Bamana are the parent language of. There's 75 languages in the Mande language family. Bamana is the parent language. That's the language I learned. Well, in this oral tradition in Mali and culture, these 3 hunters were walking beside the Niger River, and a crocodile came up out of the water and said, "You should settle here." And so they did, and that's the origin story for where Bamako comes from. Right now, with the oral tradition, Rakim, so many centuries.
I was going to say, can you verify that story about the origin of Bamako? Do you know that story?
I'm familiar with the crocodile elements, but I'm not as familiar with the origin of that he's referring to right now. I'm not.
Yeah, I was just checking. Yeah, I was just checking because I wasn't familiar with that story. That's interesting etymology. I just want to know if you had anything else on that. Cool.
Have passed since this thing allegedly happened, and there's this mythical element of this crocodile coming up out of the water and speaking, or even if we don't call it mythical, we might call it legendary, because there's hunters in West Africa that can talk to animals, which is incredible. But so that's oral tradition. Oral, and we often, as African Americans, African descended people, sometimes, I'm not continental African so much, but everyone else in the diaspora, we tend to conflate the term oral tradition and oral history together. We say, what's the oral history of my family? Oh, I'm going to tell you what I heard from my great grandmother, right? Getting to the pretendianism, right? It's often them saying, oh, my nana told me we were Cherokees. Okay. So that's
what I was talking about there. You see the kind of the subtle undermining of people's oral traditions. I just I'm not a great fan of that.
Yeah, me neither.
There's a lot of that takes place.
Yeah, and I have a different definition of orality. I don't want to get into it now because it would really take up the whole live. But it seems as if he was stating that genealogy is oral history, or he's particularly referring to oral genealogy, whereas there's other aspects of oral history that are not limited specifically to genealogy. But that's kind of a little bit in the weeds there.
Cool. All right, let's go.
That's our oral history. Right. So oral history is not actually that, but I'm going to back up one level and talk about the third piece, and I'll connect them all together. So oral testimony is any statement that's made within living memory of the person, right? So what does that mean? It typically spans from great grandparent to great grandchild. So if I have a great grandparent and she's 90 and I'm 6 and she tells me something and then she passes away, that's within my living memory. I can remember that. Now the trick though is that, like, yo, at age 6, what can you really remember? And B, what can you actually understand about the significance of what she's telling you?
Right.
You haven't become an adult or matured yet. And it's very rare that, now it's different now because like when you have teenagers having children, then they could have a great grandmother, right? So you could extend that a little bit and say great grandmother could be alive when you're an infant or you're really young. But basically, like, human beings cannot remember more than 100 years worth of stuff that other people have said. And it's a natural cap. Now, writing and recording devices, now you got streaming, you got the web, you got, before that you had tape recorders. Okay, you can record stuff and you can keep it in the memory for longer. But generally speaking, as a rule, about 100 years is as long as people have an active living memory of what they've heard from the people around them. That's oral testimony. And I always tell people, like, so oral testimony has to be something that, like, a person in my family actually heard that they communicated to me or to someone I know and I trust that person.
Right.
100-year gap. Now, what's oral history? So oral history, here's the trick. Oral history is when you collect tens and tens or hundreds of accounts, and then you collate them all together. And with the power of computing, I can then ask the computer, what are all the similarities between all these oral testimonies? Right. And then,
can I just add, you don't need a computer to do that either. That was the first thing that I thought of then. Because now he's talking about, that, I mean, that sounds like an AI task. Before AI, would you have been using a computer to collate oral histories? Because I haven't seen any kind of like qualitative analysis tool that existed before AI. Quantitative maybe, but not qualitative. So he's talking about very recent technology. So people were able to collate oral histories before 2 to 3 years ago. So I don't. Once again, it's this idea of newness being given primacy that I'm struggling with the way he's arguing this.
And it's also kind of like, okay, it's getting into like the nature of the Jaliyah, the constitution of the Jaliyah, in the relationship between the Horon or the ruler and the Jelly, which is the griot. And if you're dealing with the traditional charter of the Kuragan Fuga, and a lot of these historians, they definitively have records that go beyond a century, some of them as high as 7 centuries, right? But I'm not sure if, Dr. Aden interacted with them to that level, because a lot of times you have to go to specific cities like Kella, Niagasola, right? Or Banjul in Gambia. So there's certain cities with, certain really, really official, for the lack of a better word, or legit, jellies with specific traditions and specific ordinances that they have to follow. But long story short, in many ways, oral history is a lot more difficult to fabricate than written, especially in the African context, and especially within the so-called Mande context, because there's a lot of social implications, like the fabric of society in many ways, especially the relationship between the Horon and the Jelly, is rooted in the accurate and legitimate and authentic testimonies of these griots. And if they get something wrong, there's actually like socio-political implications of that. So long story short, again, I would say that they could go longer than that, and it's a lot more deeper and rigorous than what meets the eye.
Yeah. And also, I mean, just on the back of that as well, it's just also the relationship between, even where, so I don't want to go too much into the societies that did and didn't have writing, because I think he's very erroneous on that topic, and I think we're going to get onto that in a moment.
Yeah, we will.
But in addition to that, the artistic contribution as well. So even if you look at a tradition like the Benin Bonzes, which worked hand in hand with all traditions to tell histories that went back hundreds, if not thousands of years, and worked like really kind of like your early form of coat of arms / hieroglyphs, in terms of, well, not early forms, but a different form, where it requires someone who knows the oral history to tell the history alongside the artwork. So just these things that are perhaps being overlooked slightly, I would say,
Yeah, we're gonna get into that because there's a deeper conversation to have about the writing in and of itself.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll get there.
Then you start to build up. Now, oral history can't be done unless you do legwork in the archives and newspapers. You need other sources. So, and there's two different types of informants in oral history. And I learned all this in grad school, right? Mm-hmm. There's a traditional, there's a regular schmegular informant. That's what I like to call regular schmegular informant. They're busy, they're working, they're raising kids. They may encounter things, but like they're not watching the news every day. They don't have a very deep level of analysis, but I'm not saying that to put them down. Yeah. They're just not tapped in, right, necessarily to the deeper analysis of what's unfolding in their life. And then there are encyclopedic informants, right? Encyclopedic informants are like, yo, they remember names, dates, when a person was a head of state, like a president or a prime minister. They remember significant events. Oh yeah, that hurricane hit Florida in 1994. Like, and they not only have that, they have taken some time to think about the significance and implications of those events, and they can connect these things together in a web, right? So in my field research project, I was a Fulbright fellow to the Republic of Mali in the late 90s, and I lived there for a year. I interviewed 300 blacksmiths in Bamana.
Wow.
And so, and then many of them were old, but I probably had 6 or 7 encyclopedic informants in that group. And that was rare because it was a larger number than I would normally encounter. But Mande cultures are oral cultures.
Yes.
Right. Writing didn't come till not until the colonial period did they actually start writing stuff down about that society. Before that, they had a complex system of oral memory.
Do you want to jump in there?
yeah. Let's quickly jump in here. So again, like that argument is a Eurocentric argument. And first of all, like even when we're getting into the definition of time, the idea of the linear progression between prehistory to history and what we're dealing with now, that's not something that African-centered scholars deal with. They deal with more of a cyclical nature of time. So like, because the future is a reflection of past, writing in and of itself in that model is not some like great marker or bifurcation between what is literacy and pre-literacy or what is advanced and non-advanced, right? So that's not something that they actually dealt with. And then when we're dealing with writing itself, I mean, the idea that any African civilization was pre-literate is unfounded, especially when you deal with the fact that writing itself came from Africa. Like the letters that we use, whether it's the Arabic script, whether it's the Latin script, these are letters that came from the African continent in the Medu Neter, right? And then as we're relating to the Mande, I'm trying to bring something up. Basically, it's a comparison that shows you the relationship between various Mande writing systems and the Medu Neter, and it shows that the similarities with respect to form as well as meaning, right? And African-centered scholars have dealt with this like ad nauseum, from Jacques Habib to Musa Lam to Theophilo Benga. And what they've spoken about is a common cultural matrix where a lot of the newer African writing systems that existed and that were created in West Africa were only just an emanation of pre-existing like pharaonic or pre-existing African structures. And I'm not sure if this can be seen. This screen right here.
1 second.
Let me see if I can bring that up real quick.
Yeah, I'll add it to the stage for you.
Okay, for sure. I'm trying to get it in my, because I have a lot of screens open. Let me know when it's good.
I got to remove my screen. 1 second.
Okay.
Just quickly remove my screen.
For sure. Okay, so this is dealing with just some of the relationships between West African writing systems and the Medu Neter, and this is what African scholars have dealt with, because this point has been attacked like periodically by African scholars. Even in the UNESCO General History of Africa, Volume 1, you had an article by Pathe Diang, and this was in the 80s, so this is like 40 years ago that this was written, where they exposed the fact that the Dahomey hieroglyphs bear structural and semantic value similarities with the Medu Neter. And this is the Dahomeys in Benin, in Togo, right? So that's Pathe Diang, who is a major linguist on the African continent, who wrote that article, right? So then you have Jacques Habib, which I mentioned earlier, Theophilo Benga, and Musa Lam. And they've dealt with, these different scripts that have a deep relationship. And on the right here, you can see the Medu Neter in the face. And then on the left, you see the Medu Neter, and on the right, you see the Vi, in this case, the Vi glyphs of the Vi syllabary. And you see the Unicode there as well. And this compilation comes from Theophilo Benga. I think in a previous slide that you did with Reggie, he talked about Nyangabora, who also referenced these charts in his text as well. You could also find it on the Journal of African Civilizations, Egyptology and African Civilizations, or Ankh Online, where it also shows this. And you can just scroll down. Like, you can look at the face glyph, the hair glyph, the leg glyph right there. You have the horse glyph in E6, bearing some similarity with Vi. And you see the phonetic values here and the Vi values on the very right. And scrolling down to continue, you have the horn glyph right there and open. You have the duck, right, which the previous version of the duck with this little S for the Vi looked more similar to the duck there as well. You have the hastening man, right? And a lot of these, like the right glyph right here is the Vi. This is the more modern version of it, but the previous version was more like resembling a man. You have the flower here, obviously, that's clear. The sun, disk, and ku, sunshine there. The road with shrubs and poo right there. Ripple of water. The chem glyph 049 for black that we see with village, and you have it in the new for the Vi case. You have the harpoon bilateral, and you see that in Wu with Vi. The arrowhead, you see that in Yi with Vi. Again, Wu and Yi are a more later version of this. And it just goes on and on, from the cattle hobble to the vertical plurality strokes. And then moving on to Mende, Kikakui, you see some of the same things. Nde, Kapu, the heart and windpipe, and the different versions of that compiled by David Dalby, the horned viper, right there in the same case. And both of these cases in Mende and Vi that you see here are literally Mande speakers. So they're literally versions, according to the previous scholars, that, they're related to an African cultural substratum. That's the only way that you would have these glyphs separated by thousands of years, by the way, separated by thousands of miles, have the same in meaning. It's the only way that that's possible.
But also, I'm just thinking on a very basic level, but I'm just thinking Timbuktu, Mali Empire.
And that's later on with the
but because he said colonial, right? And we know that
colonial.
We already know we've got writing in the 13th century, books, manuscripts dating back to the 13th century from, in Mandi scripts, in Ajami, in Bambara, in Soninke, which are Mandi. I do not understand where the argument came from. we're talking about early medieval, prior to any colonial contact, evidence of manuscripts and books. So I don't know where that argument, where that the Malian or the Mandi people, couldn't write or weren't writing or were purely oral. That's not supported.
It's not
if he's trying to introduce the idea that it was colonial contact that spurred the construction of the Timbuktu libraries, that's just reverse. That is just literally backwards. There's nothing supporting that. That's literally nothing supporting that.
But even his own source, in Delafosse, he mentioned that earlier in the video. Delafosse wrote a French text where he stated that the Vi script, at the very least, according to his conversation with, the type of encyclopedic griots, said that at the very least, it went back to the 17th century. And then Delafosse even intimated that it could have been back even further, even though him as a European, he said that, European slavers, the impact of European slavers was the impetus behind the development of Vi. But in that same source, he even related Tifinagh, which is even more ancient, Tifinagh being used for the Berbers, which other scholars like Felix Chami have related the schematic geometric amorphous writings of the Swahili coast to that same Tifinagh Garamonte writing. But Maurice Delafosse, which John Aden uses as a source for some of his information for his dissertation, related Vi, a Mande script, to Berber and Tifinagh, and even related it to some of the glyphs in the Bandiagara encarpment in Mali where the Dogon and various Bambara people lived. So like even his own source stated that that's not true. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. Like, so this is a point that we have to completely harp on. And I want to remove this real quick. I want to share another screen, which is another example of something that most people probably are unfamiliar with. And this is another glyph system. I think you could see that.
Yeah, I can see it. I'm just going to put on the screen now.
So this is a writing system found near the or in the Hode Depression. For those of you who are familiar with West African archaeology, the Hode Depression is what housed the Kakoro culture, or what is known as the Tichit culture by archaeologists. And this would have been a writing system that was used in the Ghana Empire, in the Ouagadougou Empire, by, again, Mande speakers. So this would be before Islam, before European colonialism. There was a cryptographic writing system used by the Soninke, by the Mande people and other related people to encode messages, right? So that is crystal clear for anybody who has any doubts about this. And these are just different informants on the top, just showing you the different relationships between these different writing systems found in the Hode Depression, you know, by these different populations. Again, you know, this is a
so give the date again to the people. Make sure that they were listening. So when does this date back to?
So this would have been back to the Ouagadougou Empire. So this would have been used. You know, this is the Ghana. This would have been like 7th century. You know, to I believe the 12th century. You know, around that period of time of the Ouagadougou Empire, the Ghana Empire before the Malian Empire, right? So this would. So
then we got an almost unbroken line of writing, right from the 7th century through to the Empire of Mali, which would bring us to the late medieval, early modern era until the eventual deconstruction by Moroccans. I was gonna say Europeans, but it was Moroccans who actually sacked Timbuktu. But either which way, you know, to make the claim that the Mande were purely oral people with that amount of evidence of them, you know, having various scripts in their culture seems a little bit, you know, I don't know.
I got one more thing to share.
It's a little bit unfounded. Yeah.
Well, I got one more thing to share on this point. Again, the haters are not going to like this, but who cares?
Ignore the haters. They got nothing to say.
Yeah. So this is an example of just some commonalities that you see, you know, in the Mohara stele, which was a Mesoamerican stele. You see various glyphs on the stela that are extremely similar to what you see as Vi glyphs in the Vi syllabary on the right here in this graphic on the screen. So you can clearly see that, you know, scholars like David Kelly, Onuegbu Rashidi, no, Clyde Winters was not the originator of this. You had scholars like Weiner and even Rafanescu before him who found similarities between Tifinagh, Mande, and various glyphs that they saw in the Americas. Kofi Wangara is another scholar. Moncayo from Colombia is a scholar. Edward Gaines, who submitted a paper to a conference in South Africa about this, you know, is another scholar who noted this. Kamugisha, you know, from the Journal of Caribbean History, also submitted this. Shuja is another scholar who spoke about this. And I want to go down a little bit more. I'm trying to find the exact screen here. So right here on the next one, you can see Mende glyphs that are extremely similar. If you look at, you know, some of these Mesoamerican stelae, you can see literally the exact same, or almost virtually similar, the exact same glyphs that you see in the Mende Kikakui script that you see in this Mesoamerican, in Monte Alban, specifically the Monte Alban glyphs in Mesoamerica. So for people who are looking for specific archaeological evidence of contact between Africa and Mesoamerica, when you see these glyphs that are almost exactly the same, right, between Vi and Mende, as well as, you know, what we showed previously in terms of the relationship between Mende and Medu Necher, this is definitive archaeological evidence. I mean, this is impossible to deny. Like what? How do you think that they would deny this?
Is it black people? That's normally all you need, you know. Who made this? Oh well, doesn't it exist then? Or we introduced it. You know how it goes, man. Yeah, absolutely. Let me give a shout out to Don Sational. Thank you very much, brother, for your $10. He said he just contradicted himself. He said dates can be remembered, but Ethiopia and China year scheme, dating numbering scheme is different from ours, and language. He said 1480 different calendar exists. That's gone over my head a bit. I'm not gonna lie.
He said the year scheme, dating number scheme is different from our language. 1480 different calendar exists. I'm not sure what he's trying to say here. I'm not sure.
Feel free to write your comment again, Don Sational. Help us to like understand it, and I'll put it on the screen once you've if you wanted to reword that, because that's gone over both of our heads. Yeah. But I'm gonna pop the video back on now, yeah?
For sure. Yep.
Cool. Bit of a side quest there, but I feel that point regarding the Mende people's capability to write was one that we probably should drive home.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah. Okay. Let's carry on.
And they had oral history, oral tradition, and oral testimony, and they had a system for how to remember and communicate that. Mm-hmm. So, you know, like what's powerful about it is like for many black people, what I started to say, well, I said it earlier, is that we tend to conflate these things together. Like, oh yeah, what's the oral history of my family, or the oral tradition in my family is, and then you fill in the blank. Mm-hmm. And so the thing about it is oral traditions can have historically accurate information in them, but they need to be corroborated by something else. Now in African history, like the Africanist scholars, the historians were like, well, many of these societies don't develop writing until a certain time. Not all. There's some societies that develop writing, which, you know, the Pan-Africanists in your audience aren't going to know that. But so what happens is they're like, well, we need to corroborate this with other data. So they start looking at ecological data. They look at, you know, they can look at tree rings.
And pause real quick on this one. Real quick, I'm going to say something.
Yeah.
I actually like how he said Africanist scholars. You got to pay attention to that word. Yeah. Africanist scholars, they don't accept this stuff at all because they're coming from a certain framework. They're different from Pan-Africanists or Africana scholars. Yeah. You got to be very, very specific about that distinction.
You know what's funny? I know this is totally once again a side quest, but it actually reminds me as well of the discussion that I had with Dr. Painter, and she mentioned about the fact that a lot of the time the work we do is gatekept by these Africanist scholars.
Yep.
So you're going in there, as a black scholar attempting to do something, and your work is essentially gatekept because the Africanist scholars, the white ones, obviously, are seen as the authority on the subject of Black and African history, which is just like it's a shocking. You're
an expert on Yoruba culture. You're an expert on Yoruba language. You've reconstructed Yoruba. You know how all of the African languages and cultures relate to each other. And if you step outside of it, if an African says, no, this is not my local history, this isn't even what I learned in my local universities, and you oppose Africanist, that's pseudoscientific. No. We have a different framework. Your framework is white supremacy and colonialism, and our framework is authenticity.
Yeah. I mean, I'm going to leave it at that, because I've got that will bring me down a lot of other paths where I can just talk about, you know, the innate trust, which this guy in some ways is portraying, that a lot of scholars have for not only the people who laid the groundwork for their studies and their beliefs, but for the people who currently occupy those spaces. And the fact that if all of your research is just corroborating with Eurocentric, you know, existing Eurocentric belief systems, then you probably aren't researching enough, because you know there's been no effort to really investigate the capability of Black or African people. But anyway, that's a whole side quest. Let me carry on pressing play.
environmental catastrophes and events that happen that leave traces in human society, right? And so like that becomes important. You've got ethnobotanical evidence, you've got archaeolinguistic evidence, which is where you study ancient languages and how they move through geographic space.
Right.
Like, and you know, so there's, you know, Africanist historians were in an awkward position because for two reasons. One, Europeans had collaborated in the colonizing, and European scholars of Africa had collaborated in the colonial process up to a certain point.
Right.
And so they were, you know, in anthropology, sociocultural anthropology, this is called the handmaids of colonialism. And then at some point, Europeans and white Americans realized, like, wait, we're participating in violently brutalizing this population we're trying to study. It's a conflict of interest. So they start critiquing their own systems, right? And at that point, African knowledge becomes much more central in the development of Africa's historical narratives. And these people they're duty bound to go ask Africans, what's your oral tradition? Like, even it doesn't matter. Did it happen?
See, I think this is romantic of him. And my question would be here, who are these? I would like to have this conversation with him, obviously. It's not fair for me to say it now, but I'd like to know who are these scholars who he felt really brought a challenge to the existing paradigms? Because to me, this sounds very romantic. Because to be honest with you, from my understanding, a lot of the progress and a lot of the challenge always seems to come from our side. We're the ones who trailblaze in terms of the understanding of African history. He's just kind of like said, oh yeah, they came to a realization, oh, that these people were amazing, or you know, these people that we're brutalizing aren't all completely stupid. So they started to critique their own work. I was like, well, that's not how I read it, you know. That's not how I read it. In fact, I remember Champollion the Younger saying something along those lines, and then his friggin' older brother, you know, completely almost erasing all of his work and completely undermining him, saying, no, these people are actually monkeys, you know. And then every Egyptologist after him for 100 years was racist. So the idea that they came to this point where they had this enlightenment and then they started including Africans, I think that's ahistorical. I've only seen us progress when we got involved with the studying of our own history.
Yeah, it's always been a war on our part to gain acceptance just from the establishment of Black studies into like the humanity, race, and IQ. Like we've always had to pressure like immensely just to get a basic modicum of respect in these spaces. So that's always been a fact. And I will personally call Cap, but if there are some good folks that he could represent, I would be happy to hear that.
Yeah, and it was like I said, in America, it was the HBCUs, it was the Africana scholars, it was the existence of people like W.E.B. Du Bois and his, you know, his newsletter, you know, his weekly newsletter they used to post. Those are the things that pushed, you know, the study of African, you know, of Africans and Black people forward. It wasn't some, you know, self-reflective Eurocentrist who suddenly felt guilty. I don't know what kind of version of history that is. That's my opinion.
Nothing to add there.
Happened 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, doesn't matter. What do local people say about it? Right. And so that is where now, when you're thinking of, you got oral testimony, you got oral traditions over here, which kind of have these legendary elements to them. It could have happened that way, but no one can say. We don't have any way to corroborate whether this crocodile came up out of the water or not. Now, in the colonial period, Europeans were like, it's our job to say what the truth is of these people's societies, and they're just myths. We don't know if that's true or not. Modern sociocultural social historians like me, we don't ask that. We ask, why did the people believe what they believe? That's more important to me than me being a scientific authority and saying this definitely happened, that didn't happen. It doesn't mean facts aren't important. There's some things that are factual, like, you know, did the British, you know, build a colonial tax office in Port Harcourt in Nigeria in 1922? Well, that's a fact. We can verify that. But some of these other ideas are much more complex. So,
Wesker, do you agree with that? So I'm just throwing out a question to one of the guys in the chat, whose his passion is African architecture. So that colonial, I think he said post office built in 1922. Do you agree that that's a European construct? Shout out Wesker. Let me know what you think.
We had to learn how to read colonial era texts because they're not just throwaway texts. There's so much stuff like when the French went into Mali, well, they called the entire region French Sudan. And, you know, that was right next, well, Senegal, Ivory Coast, Burkina Faso, Niger, right, Mali, like French Sudan. the French wrote a lot of stuff down when they first went in there. Why? Because they wanted to know the culture so they could colonize and brutalize it more effectively.
Wow.
Like, this is really important because the sources that Van Sertima is using, he doesn't read between these lines because he never learned how to do it. The methodology for how to do that was developed later.
Yeah, right.
And there's some people who are like, yo, well, white people wrote it or Europeans wrote it. We just throw it away. It's useless. It's like, that's not a modern social historian does not take that approach, because we'll be throwing, a lot of good information away. So the Europeans, like, and there's this dude I read in French, Maurice Delafosse. He worked in the French Sudan, and he was a French ethnographer, which is a precursor to an anthropologist. And like, he's helping them, his work is helping the French dominate people in French Sudan. But the stuff he writes about Bamana culture, Malian culture, Kasonke culture, like, these are different ethnic groups, right? Because we don't use the term tribe, because the term tribe was basically like the N-word. It was a slur aimed at diminishing the sophistication of these African societies. The only place on the continent where the term tribe is used by scholars is either when continental Africans use it to describe their own social units and they were colonized by the British. Mm-hmm. Those two things are the only places. So you go to Ghana, you go to Nigeria, you go to Kenya, the term tribe will appear. Like, local people will use it. It's in the textbooks, but scholars don't use that term. They use the term ethnic group. But long story short, like Maurice Delafosse, the stuff he wrote about, well, other Mande specialists start looking at his writing, and he's just one of, like, there's 20 different people who passed through that zone who wrote about it. Well, what's the next step? Go do an oral interview with local, knowledgeable social historians in Mali. That means go ask the griots. Were these social practices or not? And the griots are like, yeah, this is.
And I would just jump in at this point, because the two things that come to my mind is the first thing is that this contradicts the point that he said earlier, which I did pull up, was that he was critiquing Van Sertima for using white scholars. That was his exact words. It's like, oh, we critiqued him for using white scholars. But also, I think, and I'm not sure if he's touching on this point, because he's touched on the point that colonial forces used scholarship, but scholarship was also a means of propaganda. So it was a means of understanding culture. But I think what he's also missing is that scholarship was used for propaganda. Scholarship was used to rewrite African history. So a lot of the time is they would deliberately undermine the capabilities or the histories of the people that they were encountering. A example I can give you is a book that I've got from 1830s. I've got it right here. I accidentally bought 2 copies of it, actually. Okay. And it's called The New Complete Authentic Universal System of Geography by George Henry Miller. It's a massive, chunky book. It's like huge. It looks like the Bible. But this book was written I think in the late 18th, early 19th century by a British scholar, and it was supposed to be like a complete history, like geographical history of the world. Now, if you read this book and you read about the Empire of Benin, so the Empire of Great Benin, he makes it sound like a small shanty town. Literally, he undermines the fact that he even believes the Benin bronzes came from there. He says all this talk of there being there was never a great city here. All I found was a couple of shacks. Now, if you just read this book in isolation, that would be your conclusion about this great empire of West Africa. If we didn't have the Portuguese text to juxtapose this with, much of that history will be lost to the propaganda of the British. Who were deliberately writing down that civilization in order to make it seem like they hadn't managed the achievements that they had achieved. So this is one of the just important things that needs to be noted here when he's kind of talking about the writings of the French, who are just like the British, a very barbaric and a very destructive colonial empire. One of the things they're going to do is they're going to make sure they communicate a version of the people they interact with that reflects the state that they're going to leave that place in. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, it even gets over to like the idea of like primary sources and secondary sources, because people talk about, that being a universal standard in the academy, which it's not. It actually comes from Ranke, which is a German scholar. And if you're using like the 19th century definition of primary sources, this is a contemporaneous written document from an eyewitness official. And the official, which would be the British gentleman in your case, if I could use that word, or Delafosse in this case, because they considered their official sources connected to their, political authority to be the only way of validating whether or not a source was primary. And many scholars have moved away from this, like now modern Western scholars accept oral testimonies as primary and other, particular pieces of evidence as primary. But you have other schools, like the Ranke school that I just mentioned is positivist. You have the hermeneutic school, you have Marxist, postmodernist, a now school, post-colonial, microhistory, et cetera, et cetera. So there's different epistemological frameworks to build what is a fact, right? And it's not just Ranke or like the standard definition of this is primary because an official wrote it down and connected it to the British Empire's objective to take over the entire land, right? That's just not the way that works.
Absolutely. Should we carry on?
Yeah, we can go on.
I just want to give a quick reminder, guys. Camjiverse is here. We're just going through and critiquing this video about Ivan van Sertima's work, They Came Before Columbus, which is being critiqued by one Dr. John Aden on the channel Why is the Dome TV. He was here earlier. I think he got tired and he left. He was like, hey man, you guys critiquing the whole damn video. And he disappeared. So he's not here anymore. Well, he might be here. I don't know. Maybe he'll shout us out. But please support Camjiverse. His channel was recently demonetized in the past couple of days. So there's a few links in the chat. Okay, please follow him on Substack. If you believe in his research and you want to support him, his Patreon link is also there, and he also has a Cash App. Okay, so please support the brother as much as possible. He is not being given anything. And I'm gonna just add to that appeal a little bit. You have to understand, like, being independent researchers is not the most it's not the easiest job in the world. There's a lot of dedication that goes in the work that we do. And you have to understand people who, Eurocentric researchers and Eurocentric, they're getting grants, they're getting funded, and a lot of these racist channels, I don't have to name them, you guys know what they're called, they make a lot of income from basically spreading hate and misinformation about our community. It's very hard to commit yourself to the kind of research that we do without having some kind of upkeep. And when you have a channel that's being suppressed, it's not easy, and obviously it's almost impossible when you get to a stage when your channel's been demonetized. So just bear that in mind as you're here and you're enjoying the discourse. Okay, appreciate you all. Thank you very much, Dregger, for your $2. Appreciate it. He says yo to you. I see Dregger all the time, so shout out to you, brother. Okay, let's carry on.
This is a Monday practice. That's where the corroboration point happens that people often miss when they say just Europeans wrote it, throw it out. It's written in 1924, throw it out. Well, Van Sertima didn't do that because that methodology had not been developed yet. Right. And now with computing, we can see stuff we couldn't even connect the dots on before because, AI is just like, it's so powerful. You have to be careful, of course, and you need to go.
And this is what I mean. Again, I think this is just so invalid. I'm sorry. Any mention of AI as a critique is so invalid. You're mentioning a brand new technology as a means of critiquing. I don't know. It just seems incredibly unfair. Oh, he didn't have AI, so what is he doing? It's like,
AI is very limited.
That's a really invalid argument.
Studying it, I'm studying like different AI architectures as part of like my next career journey, and it is heavily limited. Without the right efficient, architectural structure, it's pretty useless, and it hallucinates and gives false information.
Absolutely.
So we shouldn't trust that which we don't understand.
Yeah. Well, on that note, we could talk about genetics, because we've got some people in the chat who will appear inevitably talking about, oh, things have been proven genetically. Oh, King's monologue, silly. Who've done this? The genetics. They don't even understand genetics. I've back and forth with these people. It's like, you guys don't even understand what you're talking about. There's so many people out there who think they understand genetics, and it's so, I would say, cringeworthy listening to him harp on and regurgitate, markers and haplotypes and think that they know what they're talking about, after you've had conversations with actual real geneticists who will literally just laugh in their face for the kind of conclusions that they're making. But that's the side.
We're gonna get into that once we get through it.
Yeah, definitely.
Corroborate whatever AI is telling you. I would never say, oh, just Google it, and you have to do that, right? So these three pieces, like, you got oral testimony, you got oral, tradition over here, and oral history is when, say you have 150 oral testimonies, you combine them together and you start looking for similarities, and then you go do archival research, and then you look in the newspapers, and then you're looking at, the op-ed, columns in the local newspapers, and you're building out a life world that surrounds this information you want to know about. And then you write an oral history, and the oral history has a lot of it in it. It's not just relying on the Europeans. It's not just relying on the oral history. It's relying on the quantum of evidence that connects these pieces as corroboration. I'm a nerd, so I love how complicated African history is because of that. And I just put a quick plug in, like the best book. The best is a 5-volume set by Dr. Toyin Falola. He's a Nigerian. It's called Africa in 5 volumes. And that is the masterpiece on African history. It's published. Almost all of the scholars in it are continental Africans, writing about the histories that unfolded that they're experts in. And there are 150 scholars that were published, and each one has 25 or 30 chapters in it, and every chapter is written by Africans.
I want to get that book, by the way. Do you have that book out of interest?
By Toyin Falola?
The one that he just mentioned, the Africa, I think it was called, the oral history book.
I have
massive
recent ones. I don't know if it's the same one, but I have one of the recent texts by Toyin.
Yeah, that was a good shout. As soon as he mentioned that, I was like, I'm gonna get that book.
Yeah.
I'm gonna get that book. That book sounds banging. I'm not gonna lie. Let's carry on.
Oh wow! Oh yeah. I need that.
Yeah, must have.
Well, here's one of the things. All right. So when we look at they came before Columbus, and this, can you talk about this idea that it's proof that we made it here, from looking at those Olmec heads, and because a lot of our people are still kind of stuck on that as being proof of our trek to America before Europeans.
Yeah, I'll lay out the case, and I'll just preface it by saying that all of these claims are circumstantial, and you need something more hardened than circumstantial evidence to actually see a quantum of evidence emerge. Well, we were just talking about. So the Olmec heads are interesting because many African Americans latch on to that and say, oh, they have thick lips, they have, broad noses, they must be African. Now, that's like, in everyday speak, that's what we call lookership. It looks like this, so it must be that, right? A great example might be,
just to be clear, racism is lookership.
Yeah, most definitely.
So I think people always miss that when it comes to talking about racism. People, particularly who like to raise the straw man of, oh, they were black, but they weren't African. I'm like, what? Wait a second. Were they doing genetic testing back then when they were calling everybody Negro? Do you know what I mean? Like they were when they were in age, when they were grabbing the Negritos and they were grabbing the Aita people, when they're going across the world and grabbing every black population they could find and either mass unaliving them or placing them into slavery or shipping them from one place to the other, respectfully, they weren't doing genetic tests to see if people were related to West Africans. But that now has become like the ultimate kind of like straw man. Oh, they weren't West African. It's kind of like, wait a second, racism is literally lookership. It literally is lookership.
It is.
Yeah, that's what it was. He looks black, so we're gonna persecute him. Yeah, that's how it worked.
Most deaf.
So I just had to say that.
Yeah.
And people say, well, there's pyramids in Egypt and in Sudan, and then there's pyramids on every continent. You'll hear people say, or you hear them say, oh, there's pyramids in Latin America. Like, that's true. Now, here's the thing that structural engineers have pointed out. The second most stable platform is a tripod. Tripods emerged early in human history, way millions of years ago. Why? Because they allow you to hang a cooking vessel over a flame, and that's important for human survival. But what's the first most stable platform? A pyramid. So if you have a tripod, the most logical thing is to add a fourth stick, and then nothing moves. Right. And so the structural engineers are like, this is something that is found all over the planet. It's ubiquitous. It appears in lots and lots of cultures, but that's because it's a logical progression for humanity to ask, how can I create a more stable platform? Now, if we think about it from cooking for a minute, the number one destroyer and killer of cities and settlements in the ancient world was fire, because all the homes were made out of mud brick. You better have something more stable than a tripod that you're going to use to put over a flame, or you could burn your whole settlement down, and then everybody has to rebuild.
How flammable is mud brick? So that was a genuine question. Because he said mud brick, and then have I lost the stream? Hello? Camji, you there? Who can hear me?
Oh, yeah. My bad. I was muted. I was saying that, like,
it was a question to you. How flammable is mud brick? Genuinely, that was a genuine question.
It's not. It's not. It's not. Adobe brick is not flammable. It's not.
Yeah, I didn't think so. So when he said that, I thought, well, you just invalidated your own argument. Then he thought he was going to say that all the houses were made out of wood. It was like, oh, the other house was made out of what? Mud brick. So fire was cooling. If I was on, that doesn't.
What he said was like, you know, as a structural engineer, like what he said wasn't necessarily false when he was talking. What he was referring to was the gable structure. Particularly, like that type of structure is pretty common. I think some of the oldest, like the Koena people or the New Koen people of South Africa, were one of the first people to develop that. And then you also,
I agree with that. It was just the fire point. I was saying,
but even beyond that, I was getting at like that doesn't negate the possibility of a connection, though, because there's even been some Mexican scholars like Jose Vivanco. Who have spoken about ergological or working space parallels between that which is seen in Western Africa, like particularly the laterite or the iron-rich soil agricultural systems, right? There's some parallels between West Africa and the Yucatan Peninsula with regards to that. And there's also some, ritualistic parallels documented by other scholars in the Sino-Platonic papers of Mesoamerica, like some of the lintels that you see in ancient Nubia, you also see in Mesoamerica. The usage of sarcophaguses is similar. So there are some parallels that you can't necessarily ignore just because it's very, very common to have mounds and then pyramids eventually on top of the only true pyramids that you see would be in Africa, like up to a point. Those are the only true ones. But yeah, that's common, but it doesn't negate the possibility of a connection on the same.
Also, there is the when I was at the British Museum recently, I always knew this was the case, but I managed to get a photograph of an amazing totem pole from, I think it was the Sudan, and I thought it was American when I saw it. So this whole the totem poles that we have, that seems to be a tradition that's only seen in America and Africa again as well. And they have the same kind of expression.
Yeah, that's a whole new. And if y'all want to see me like delve into the parallels, because I was thinking of doing a video about the cultural and ritualistic parallels before I got demonetized. Hit up my Cash App, hit up my Patreon. That's definitely going to come on the way. It's definitely in the pipe. And we're going to continue to get deeper on this topic.
Yeah, I'm going to try and find that picture of the totem pole and share it with you guys before we go today as well. I'll see if I can dig that out. That'll be quite interesting to look at as well. But yeah, I've always known that was the case anyway as well. So there are these really strong parallels that exist between the continents, where it's kind of like, well, it's only these two continents that are doing this. So, we have to, there's a lot of kind of like overlap between a lot of the rituals, the language, the scripts, I should say, the shapes in the scripts, the religious kind of
protocols.
I would say kind of protocols and accoutrements, some of the things they used to carry as well. And they only exist, those parallels only exist between America and Africa. So it's just like that those things do exist, you know?
Yep, most definitely.
Yeah.
And that happened so many times in world history. So we know that, and this is where, you know, for Africanist scholars and for other scholars, it's like, you know, a thing can look similar, but within that culture, it's going to have different functions. And when you look at the pyramids and I'll get to the Olmec heads now, but when you look at the pyramids in South and Central America, and you take a cross section of those pyramids, their structures are not the same. The engineering's not the same. Their function isn't the same. Right.
And they're like 2,000 years apart.
Thank you. You could tell that too. Say that.
Well, that's not necessarily correct as well, because some of the Sudanese pyramids do overlap in time with the American ones.
And I meant to look
that would actually somewhat strengthen. Also, the design of the Sudanese pyramids are somewhat closer to the Mesoamerican ones. By the way, I'm not arguing that. This is not a point I argue about the pyramids being kind of like a cultural diffusion. I'm not aware if they are or they aren't. But I just would say that the Sudanese ones do seem to provide a little bit of it, because everyone thinks of the Great Pyramids when they think of the pyramids in when they think of the comparison point, but they never think of the Sudanese ones.
Yeah, and I'm somebody who, on this point, you know, being that this is my background of study, I was a bit more skeptical about this point, you know, because of what they mentioned. But I have to admit that I haven't done an in-depth analysis of like the fabrication, you know, the design methodology of the different builders in the past. So like I want to do that in the future, just to get like a clear look of it and just to see if there are any, because sometimes, especially when you're dealing with like project management or just design engineering in general, there may be a certain component that you borrow from a neighbor, that you borrow from a previous design, but you may not, you know, borrow the entire thing. It's called composites. So you may borrow a composite that you use in the general design. And if you don't look at the design methodology and the design philosophy, you would never know that. But that's why it takes like a meticulous type of analysis to be able to uncover these pieces and these possibilities.
I just want to quickly, whilst we're there, I've just shared it with myself. So I'm going to see if I can pull up that image of the totem pole as well, just to share with you guys. I thought when I was at the British, last time I was at the British Museum, I saw this and I thought, God, I got to share this with people. It's such a cool, visual. Let me just pull it up. Yeah, here it is. I'm just going to pop that on the screen. I'm going to zoom in so you can see this. So this is a Sudanese totem pole. This is Sudan.
Wow.
That's a Sudanese totem pole.
That's crazy. Where is this housed?
British Museum. These are Sudanese. Yeah, these are from Sudan, these totem poles.
That looks like a lot of what we see in West Africa, in Central Africa too. That's crazy. Yeah. You would think that was like Native American, like if you just looked at it, or Polynesian.
Exactly. So it's that cultural continuity once again, you know. That's quite a strong one. So I just thought I'd share that.
That's pretty powerful.
Yeah, I thought so. Let's carry on.
Say that, you know, I mean, the ancient Egyptians stopped making pyramids, and then, you know, boom, like all this time passes, then the Olmecs make them. It's like, oh, there must be a point. And this is the other thing. So in modern like evidence, I just mentioned this stuff that people could go Google in your audience, but so you have the scientific method, which everybody should be familiar with, but not many people know there's a social scientific method. You can Google that too. And there's an archaeological method, right? And so how is evidence validated becomes important. And for people who latch onto the Olmec heads and say, oh, we were here before, you know, like you got to get more points of evidence in there than just, it looks like this. Now I'll just say like, and you can pull this up, but you know, the skin color map is something you can Google. And the skin color map shows bands of skin tone variation in relationship to the equator. If you're on the equator or very close to it, you have the darkest skin. As you move farther north of the equator, your skin, you know, gets progressively lighter because that's human adaptation to the sun. And so anyone who's in this band in Central America is on the freaking equator. Like, so you have, and there's two human adaptations to this that are important. Everywhere on the equator, people have broad noses and thick lips because this is how our bodies regulate heat.
Right.
How, and we have dark skin because that's how we process vitamin D. There's a lot of sunlight in these areas, so we need to process more. We need more filters, right? Whereas,
one second, I'm going to bring that back because did he just make the equatorial argument there? I wasn't really paying attention.
Yeah, the skin color map. Yeah.
No, we're gonna have to check that. We're gonna have to check that.
And you can pull this up, but you know, the skin color map is something you can Google, and the skin color map shows bands of skin tone variation in relationship to the equator. If you
okay, so I'm gonna just check this point really quickly because people have made this point before, and a lot of Eurocentrists like to argue this point. They pull up the skin color map and they go, "Oh, look, people get darker towards the equator and they're like lighter towards it." The skin color map tells you one thing, okay, and it tells you where white people have successfully integrated themselves and where they can survive. That's what it tells you. Because if you went back 1,000 years, okay, that entire skin color map would be black apart from little patches here and there. Okay, so all it tells you is where white people are comfortable enough to settle. That's what it tells you. The reason it gets really dark towards the equator is because even though white people were able to militarily conquer these people, those areas were not suitable for them to settle. That's why we have skin color gradients. It's very, very simple. Okay, it's nothing to do with human adaptation over time. And like it or not, for all of you people who like to make the genetic argument, genetics supports this. Genetics supports bottlenecks and founder effects and small populations spreading rapidly. Right now, the population that has spread the most rapidly is the modern white Indo-European, who is now in 3 more continents than he was 400 years ago. Okay, so people acting like this skin color map is an archaic thing and it shows the process of evolution over time. I'm sorry, but that's ahistorical. And the fact that, a guy like this is arguing this like he hasn't read a history, but guys, let's screw on our heads. There wasn't no long process of, the browning and the whitening of people due to being in cold climate. That's a load of nonsense, respectfully.
Yeah, you may have watched the pseudo killers a few times.
Well, they must love the skin color map, isn't it?
Yeah, they love that.
Yeah,
they love that.
Yeah. Unthinking people like the skin color map. They think it proves something. It's kind of like, you do realize if you're gonna buy into the skin color map that you've just literally disregarded everything about genetics that you guys harp on about. You do realize that, yeah, you can throw away your Yam Naya expansion, this, that, and the other, because that's got nothing to do with the skin color map. Okay, there you go. People want to believe what they want to believe, I guess.
You're on the equator or very close to it, you have the darkest skin. As you move farther north of the equator, your skin, gets progressively lighter because that's human adaptation to the sun. And so anyone who's in this band in Central America is on the freaking equator. So you have, and there's 2 human adaptations to this that are important. Everywhere on the equator, people have broad noses and thick lips because this is how our bodies regulate heat.
Right.
And we have dark skin because that's how we process vitamin D. There's a lot of sunlight in these areas, so we need to process more. We need more filters.
And I think that's part of the issue is that a lot of these people think that's only us, right? They don't see that as, indigenous peoples or, Latin American people. Like, that's only us.
Once again, that doesn't move in a linear gradient as well, because there's populations that aren't haven't got that closer proximity to the equator that are have broader nose and thicker lips than populations that literally sit on the equator. So once again, these are difficult points to argue because it's a lot more complex. And if you spoke to a physical anthropologist, they wouldn't give you these kind of binaries. They might talk about some of these adaptations, but being an adaptation to tropical climates, but they'll talk about things like altitude, like I talk about tropical climate versus arid climates. There's other things that have contributed to that as well. I'd also push an argument for the amount of non-Homo sapien ancestry being another phenotypic contribution. So there's just so many different you're muted, by the way, Cam G, if you're there. There's so many different contributing factors to, you know, people's resulting phenotypes, and I don't think that they're
it's a lot more complicated.
It's a lot more complicated than the way he's putting it.
Yeah, it's way more complicated. Like it's super complicated. As you stated before, like Labrana man in Mesolithic Spain, like 7,000 years ago, was very dark skinned, and he's outside of the dark skin zone. So like there's clearly like, you know, human evolutionary, you know, outliers. I wouldn't even say outliers. These are human evolutionary contradictions to the skin color map. And like the way you put it was brilliantly, because I hadn't even thought about that. Like literally, it's basically saying where white people can live today.
Yeah, exactly. That's literally it. I mean, they do try, like they do in you know, in the Little Hat Nation. So there's a bunch of them there, but then if you look at the skin cancer rates, it doesn't sound like it's got much longevity. It doesn't sound sustainable. You know, their attempts to live in these different, you know, in these warmer climates.
Them and Elon Musk's cousin have like the highest skin cancer rates on the planet.
Yeah, and Australians, yeah, exactly, because they're where they're not supposed to be, essentially. Yeah. Let's carry on.
It's like broad nose, thick lips, and how
that's right.
Yeah, and you know the fact that we have melanin is like, yo, everybody has melanin.
Yep, everybody. You know, you'll hear. I mean, there are some. I hesitate to call conspiracy theorists out there, but they're like, "Oh, there's you melanin, and it's unique to us." And I'm just like, "Stop it! Just stop talking." You know. So, and if you look around the world on the equation.
I'm sorry. What was his point there? Because that's not a conspiracy theory. Sorry, man. Sometimes people just like they do too much. How is that a conspiracy theory that Black people have far more melanin than and melanin deficient people? And yes, there are people out there who have zero melanin. Okay, and they're not just albino; they're also very, very pale people. I was like, I don't understand his point here.
Yeah, it's kind of like, I think they're just trying to say that there's natural, like I think Ann Cyphers made this point as well. Basically saying that even if the Olmecs or any pre-Columbian Native American looks exactly like Black people, there are natural reasons that don't relate to them coming directly from Africa as to why they look like Black people. I think that's where he's getting at.
Okay, that's cool. I hope that he can keep that energy though, because it's very quick that people go from making that argument to say, hey, they looked just like Africans, but they weren't African, to there were no Black people in America. And I find that people pendulum between the two. Do you know what I mean? They don't stick with one argument. You know, they don't go, well, there were Black people when they came there. They just weren't related to Africa. They go, oh, well, there was no Black people in America and there weren't no Africans. Kind of like, well, is that what we're doing? You know what I mean? It's like, so I'm just saying, I haven't watched this entire thing, that I hope he keeps that energy. That's all I'm saying at this stage.
Almost done.
Like, look at Melanesia, right? And even in the name Melanesia, like a European sailed there, they were like, yo, like these are Black people.
Well, I'm glad
melanin's embedded in that word.
No, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but that made me think of something.
And to be clear, they didn't just call Melanesians Black; they called all Australoids Black. So it wasn't just Melanesians. It was only up until very recently that, well, modern Australians, you know, Aboriginal people with Aboriginal blood still call themselves Black. And some of them you were looking at like, whoa, like, no, they call themselves Black. They're Black and they're proud because they remember what they were called when those British, those carnivorous, murdering, genocidal, homicidal, you know, convicts arrived from the British Isles. They remember what they were called as a population, you know. So
and even Sertima in African presence in ancient America documented this. Like, he said that the first Black people who came to the Americas 50,000 years ago were probably Australoids. So I just find it fascinating how like everybody who criticizes Sertima ignores that point, probably because they didn't read the text at all. But literally, like, he's making the same point that they're making right here.
That's very interesting. Shout out to Dregger, Just left $2. He says Elon looks European. It doesn't mean he's European. What is he then? Confused, Dregger. You have to clear me up. What is he? You're not gonna tell. You got to tell me he's native African, are you? Because I ain't gonna have none of that. Shout out to you for your $2, brother. I appreciate it. He's not even getting that from me, man. He's just something else, man. But anyway, let's carry on.
And this is another claim that they make often. I want to see if you could talk about it. Is they say, you know, the Columbus and the rest of these European explorers said that when they came to these shores that they saw black people, right? Can you talk about that claim that's made as well?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's a simple. Well, I'm gonna be generous and say it's a misreading of Columbus's journals, but it could be a open misrepresentation by some people too, right? But Columbus says like these people had, you know, they had black hair, and their hair was like a horse's mane or tail, right? They don't actually. Columbus doesn't actually say he saw black people,
right? And
so people tend to misread or misrepresent his journals, and that becomes a problem, right? And so that's one part of it. I think it's unfortunate that they don't read more deeply, but Columbus does not say he saw black people. And Bartholomew de las Casas, an important early writer in the Americas and a Catholic priest, like he doesn't say he saw black people either. So that's a part of the logic that's problematic. And you know, it is telling that the Olmec heads don't have any skin color. They haven't, you know, whether they may have been painted at one time, but there could be so much erosion. There's some techniques that are allowing scholars to like reclaim the color, like ancient Greek statues. They all look white now, but that's because they've been bleached by the elements over millennia. But we know they were painted, and they weren't painted natural colors. Right. They had purple skin, they had green hair, like because this is how the Greeks saw the gods, you know. And of course, keep in mind, like how a society sees the gods changes over time, right? And so with Van Sertima, you know, like but people will say, you know, oh yeah, we were everywhere. Which I know we can talk about how migration happens. I know that's what.
Absolutely. Because I'm glad.
I say that we were everywhere, so I'll be interested to hear how he follows up with this. That's what. I stand on that business. That yes, we were everywhere. But yeah, you carry on.
I wanted to like read because I haven't read the original Spanish facsimile of his journal. I've read English translations that have stated that he described black people, not only his ship, you know, and the people that he needed as translators, but even the people that he saw sailing back, you know, back and forth. But I want to read the original Spanish to like double check and make sure, because I'm not as like heavily invested in Columbus's journals in that way.
Yeah, I'm just I'm flicking through literally, so I'm trying to keep my eye on multiple things. But I found the book. So I'm flicking through it and I'm trying to look for references to what he's saying. But yeah, if and when I find out, I'll just read it directly out of the book.
For sure.
Look, these are perfect segues, right? Because I often ask them, I say, look, your claim is that we were always here, right? So are you telling me you're going to either believe two things, that a God put you here, right? Or you're going to believe that life evolved into Homo sapiens sapiens simultaneously in America as it did in Africa. And I don't think they understand how crazy that is. You know what I mean?
They don't.
So I found this argument difficult to understand as well, where they're going with this, because we're talking about if there was talking about the voyages to America. Those would have come far later, you know, after the essentially we've been in the same state as modern man now. I think the argument point is 250,000 years. Modern man has been in its modern Homo sapien form, and I don't think anyone's arguing for an older origin date than that. So this is why he lost me a little bit at this point.
I think what they're trying to say is that like they're people who believe that there was an independent origin of humans in America and not Africa, like getting into the people who promote that ideology. So like they're kind of really their attack against Sertima, as I stated before, is about attacking the people who believe that they're aboriginals and not related to Africa. That's essentially what they're doing. and they're jumbling it up in one.
Got it. I can see. So it's kind of like all right. It's kind of like a conflation of modern ideas versus the I guess the text that they rely upon. Okay, that makes sense. All right.
Yeah.
Oh, you hit the nail on the head. Like, and that's in bioanthropology, it's called morphology, right? If you see any species, the parent has a certain structure. Like we got 5, fingers on a hand. Well, why didn't the so-called Black indigenous, inhabitants of North America, of this hemisphere, develop a 6th finger? Right. It's because natural selection determined this is the best configuration for the hand. Now, of course, like you could have transcription.
I mean, he's talking about, hundreds of thousands going into millions of years of evolution now. So I don't know if he's being deliberately contrary or I don't know.
I would prefer if they kind of separated like the Black, Aboriginal, Native American beliefs, anti-African beliefs, if they put that in one space, and if they dealt with they came before Columbus in another space, because a lot of this stuff to me is a bit ridiculous, and I don't necessarily agree with or promote any of that stuff, but I think that's completely different than the variety of contact models developed by scholars throughout history.
And by the way, there are modern anthropologists who are still challenging the out of Africa theory. It continues to be challenged.
And but I don't necessarily. I mean, to me personally, I don't even really get into that space because, kind of like I was saying before, like there are certain things that are like such a giant hill to climb. If you want to climb it and other people want to climb it, cool. But like to me, it's not something that I generally focus on.
Yeah. No, I think that's exactly my point. It's kind of like, well, there are. I don't know why we're going down this road. Anyway, let's see where we get to.
Sometimes a child is born with a 6th finger, and then families have to figure out. They get with the doctor, and the doctor's like, "What do we do?" And they might remove it.
Right.
So, but you're absolutely right that morphology is huge. And what they're trying to say is that humanity sprung up looking exactly this way here, and in a whole different continent sprung up the same way. It's like, no, right? And we know from now, this, you really lead me down a primrose path because I want to talk about human migration, but also the genetics, right? So when Van Sertima is writing, there's no haplogroups. We didn't know haplogroups existed. Right. And so the human genome had not been mapped. Supercomputers did that, by the way. It wasn't done by hand, right? So he's writing in the 70s. None of that existed. We didn't have laptops. We didn't have, our cell phones are the most powerful supercomputers ever. They got more computing power in our back pocket than all the computing on Earth prior to like now, if you exclude quantum computing, right? So I can learn things from that device that I wouldn't otherwise be able to learn, but I can also mislearn things with that device too, which makes it dangerous. Like you got to learn how to evaluate evidence. What are your standards? What are your criteria? So let's talk, so why am I mentioning genetics? They've done the genetic analysis of all of the Olmec mummies that have been discovered, or Olmec remains in Central Mexico and Central America. And all of them are haplogroup A. They don't have any, haplogroup E, which is African, right? And there's other African ones because Africa's huge and it's complicated, but there's no A.
Wow.
Did you want to jump in there?
Yeah, you could present in the screen.
Yeah, sure.
First of all, like the idea that there's retrievable DNA from all of the Olmec remains, I don't think that's true. I've never heard a scholar
I was going to say.
Like a lot of the remains, are unable to retrieve ancient DNA from them. And then the idea that, they're ubiquitously A, I think that is unfounded as well. I think there's a scholar by the name, like Ann Cyphers, I've mentioned her. And then there's another Mexican scholar who worked under Ann Cyphers who wrote an article kind of trying to dispute the African origin or the African contact model of the Olmecs, saying that A is from Africa or A is from the Americas, unrelated to Africa. And it was actually Clyde Winters who he wrote a article, or he wrote a breakdown trying to say that A originated on the African continent, mtDNA-A, as opposed to yDNA-A, which we know is Africa. And Clyde Winters, have a lot of disagreements with Dr. Clyde Winters. But essentially, like if you look at Harvard Allen Ancient DNA Database, AADR version 9, you can see, in El Soco, Dominican Republic, in the 9th century, you see haplogroup BTM91, right? BTM91, which is, you could see the graph on the right, it is connected to African populations. Then if you scroll down and you're dealing with Saki Zul Belize, and this is in the 5th millennia BCE, you find the same haplotype. And, below that, you see some terracotta remains, and this would be archaeological evidence. These are all found in Mexico. They look like they're from Africa, but these are from the Yucatan Peninsula, terracottas from the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. And this was actually presented in 1966 at the Festival of Black Arts in Dakar, Senegal, especially to Leopold Senghor, who was a leader of Senegal at the time. Wouthana was present there. This was a kind of a Spanish to French speaking interaction, and a lot of people who speak English do not have access to this. So you've had conferences where scholars have designated, the validity of these Mesoamerican, quote unquote, pre-Columbian terracottas. And also in the African Union Fact Book in 2020, they give reference to these terracottas as archaeological evidence of African contact in Mesoamerica, before Columbus, right? And you also have, within the same vein, ancient DNA explorer, you have Chichen Itza in the 9th century, Chichen Itza, which would also be derived from the Olmec populations. And you see Chichen Itza YCH 025, as well as YCH 026 and YCH 038, having B2M 182 and BTM 91, respectively, right? And this is going to validate the contact model, right? We spoke about Guadarrama's non-metric analysis corroborating with Wyszynski in 1972, and he found biological heterogeneity, or different types, which you could define as morphological groups. You had a short-faced quadrangular orbit type, non-projected zygomatics, and a robust type with elongated dolichocephalic skulls, rounded orbits, prominent supraorbital ridges, and interiorly projecting zygomatic bones, right? We asked King's monologue here, what does that sound like, that robust type?
Yeah, you know what that sounds like. No need for me to say, but then isn't that arguing more? Because just from those descriptions that you've given me there, I'm getting a kind of very clear, almost Dinka type phenotype from those features. Well, where does that match up with what you're saying in regards to these genetics results?
Well, I would say it's B, because you have BM60 from the Sudanese Copts to Burkina Faso and Bamileke populations, and Luis Alberto Vargas Guadarrama, he actually connected them to the profile of Wyszynski's Equatorial and Dongolan being Sudanese and Equatorial being general, like West African, Sahelian type people. So it could have been either or. And obviously we do know that there's an intracontinental relationship, between those types and diversity, right? And just on and on. These are just some, Martin Bernal, he gave a response to the current anthropology, forum against Dr. Ivan van Sertima. And, he was basically defending the idea that the transatlantic voyage in the South Atlantic is more easy than the North Atlantic for a variety of environmental reasons. So to defend the Vikings, but then say that it was impossible for West Africans is cap. That's a little bit bounded. And this is another.
I mean, I would just say the numbers when it comes to the transatlantic slave trade, the numbers into South America, that I think that really deserves a some, because the numbers are outrageous, and the support for that in terms of the obviously the Spanish and the Portuguese, who were the ones who kind of operated in the southern portion, in South America, but the numbers were humongous, respectfully, and the communities they keep bringing back in terms of the genetic analysis doesn't marry with the Spanish and Portuguese colonies. So this is the thing. A lot of people are like, "Oh, it's just African, isn't it?" It's kind of like, well, wait a second. That's a big question mark, isn't it? Because how much access did the Spanish and the Portuguese have to that part of Africa where they're supposed to be, these people are supposed to have an affinity to.
Guiden, who's a Brazilian archaeologist, she just passed away last year, and someone from my comments actually noted her to me. She did a lot of work on the petroglyphs, as well as some like macro and microlithic technologies that she found in South America, and she actually promoted, and this was her life's work, that it was Africans who traveled across the Atlantic in the Paleolithic who were the first Americans, and not the Beringian populations that is generally promoted. So like, she's really famous, and I've just founded her work, and I'm going to get deeper into it. But Kamagisha, kind of along the lines of what you're saying, Dr. Aaron Kamagisha, as well as Dr. Pate Diang, they've spoken about some indigenous populations that were defined by scholars like Balboa, Gomarar, Borborg, and Garcia, Quafrages. These populations were defined as Black or African, according to these European explorers, right? So like, this is specific evidence. And then you have a myriad of evidence. Like, I think Tro Black was the one who helped me with this, him in London. The San Jose Real Hospital has a Mexican remain that's from like the late 14th, early 15th century, that has an African haplotype. It has haplotype E, right? So the idea that there's never been a haplotype E in Mexico before Columbus is not true. That's false. Wow. 100% false.
That's very interesting. And I think that going back to this whole South American thing as well, is also just consider how, the proportions and the numbers of Black populations in Southern America today, and just consider the fact that pretty much since the abolition of slavery, the numbers of Black people have been on decline in almost every South American nation. Some of them have had outright genocides.
Yeah, Argentina.
And you still have such a humongous Black population in South America. So you have to consider what was the population balance prior to these massive depopulations that we've seen on that continent, and then explain it. And obviously the only way they can explain it is by talking about these almost unimaginable transportation numbers that don't seem to add up, in my opinion. They don't add up. It's just too much. It's too much. And also the region that it came from, like I said, the genetics don't match where they should be matching to. If you're talking about the Spanish and the Portuguese colonies in Africa, it doesn't match. So there's a huge question marks that people don't want to target. It's like when you look at American genetics and they don't match sometimes, but it's like, as long as it's coming from Africa, people will just create a story that makes sense. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. It's kind of like, well, it's Africa. Everyone was a slave, but then when it's convenient, it's like, oh, it was only Nigerians, and then it was like, oh, well, it's Europe. But it's like, well, wait a second, how many Europeans were actually transported? Do you know what I mean? It's like,
yeah. It's kind of like, it's kind of like when they try to say that, oh, look, the Olmecs look like, various indigenous mestizo Mexicans, and it's like, wait, according to your model, these mestizos descend from enslaved Africans in Mexico. Yeah. So it's like they're using their own.
It's just circular argument. Yeah. Which they do a lot. They do a lot of that. So a lot of that circular arguing. Yeah, absolutely. Because you get the same thing with the Puerto Ricans as well.
Yeah. It's just like either these people descended from enslaved Africans, and that's why they look like the Olmecs, or they don't. You have to pick one.
Yeah. That's very interesting.
So we could get back into it. That was an interesting segue. So the genetics, we've done that on this channel like ad nauseum. If anybody's denying it, they simply haven't seen the evidence or they're biased.
Sweet. All right, let's carry on. How are we doing for time? Oh, we're hitting the 3-hour mark now.
Yeah.
I think we'll wrap up in the next 10 minutes, maybe. Sure. Even though I'm actually not that tired. Surprisingly, I don't know why. I should be absolutely exhausted right now.
So can you talk about that a little bit too, like the migrations? Because again, a lot of people that make these claims, I don't think they understand. I don't even think they understand the connection between genetic testing and ancient migrations. How we can tell a lot, looking at both.
Yeah, no, it's important. I mean, so it's funny. I do deep research projects. When you're an academic, you may ask different questions than other people might, because I got so much subject. I'm a subject matter expert. So when I'm saying that humbly, like I don't really ever pat myself on the back, but when I conduct these projects, I'm giving it so many resources to flesh out an understanding that I need about a particular area. And I did one on human migration. Right. Like, look, it's about, I forget, maybe it's several thousand miles from Africa to the Bering Strait. And so basically, like sociocultural anthropologists, bioanthropologists, evolutionary biologists, like $10 words, they basically figured out like how long has it taken for humanity to exit Africa and get all the way to the Pacific Rim. Right. Now, Africans traveled in different media. Some travel by boat, some travel over land. We know when they exited Africa, if they traveled by land, one huge land bridge was through the Levant, like out of East Africa, through the Levant, and then peopling the rest of the world. Of course, when they exited Africa, they started encountering new people. Obviously, they weren't Homo sapiens sapiens. They were from other branches of the humanoid family tree. So they might have been, they could have been Neanderthal, for instance, or they could have been, from other branches of the human family tree. Now, when they did that, I always talk to people about this, like this long overdue conversation about how migration actually works. Imagine you have a small band, because in most of human history, for the majority of human history, we only lived in small hunter-gatherer bands between 2 and 50 people. That was the carrying capacity that the environment would support, right? That meant that if you have 50 people on the high end, you got to kill a woolly mammoth, or you got to kill a lion, or you got to kill enough protein to provide sustenance for those people. Otherwise, they're going to die. We have to have protein synthesis happen, or our bodies don't work, right? And so my point being, when these Africans exited the continent by land, and even by sea, no one ever came to reinforce their same genetics after that. So whatever that band is, that's the genetics they had. Right. Now, as they're exiting Africa, imagine they're going through the Levant, out of North Africa into the Levant. They're encountering other humanoid life forms. They're also encountering different.
See, I don't know if that's supported. So he's talking about, essentially he's talking about like bottlenecks of groups of people leaving, and then that tiny bottleneck of people, no one coming to reinforce those genetics, so to speak. So that tiny bottleneck. So basically saying every time humans move, they move in tiny groups. Every time they move, so they move out of I'm presuming a large population in a tiny group. And no one ever comes after them. No one ever follows them. From that same group. And I just don't know how supported that is. Also, how accurate that is to what we know about human kind of cultural in terms of how humans move. I don't know if that's the case.
Yeah. He thinks that, I think he's trying to just develop a model where the out of Africa populations are completely distinct. I think that's why he mentioned the humanoids, like the Denisovans and Neanderthals. So like what he's doing in my mind, the way that I hear him, is like countering the people who say Africans were everywhere first and the original people in every land was black, by promoting the idea that these genetic bottlenecks and these mixing with Denisovans and Neanderthals created distinct populations that cannot be related to Africans. I think that's what he's trying to say.
Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna carry on listening.
Food, different animals, different languages and forms of communication. The environment is different, so their bodies start changing right away. Like the assumption is, oh well, when we see.
Yep, he just reinforced what you just said there. Yeah. So that is where he's going.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So all right, let's carry on and see I'll refute when we get there.
Black people, like women and men in Fiji, have afros, and they have black darks, like they look African. So we're like, oh, and there's people in India who look the same. So you're like, oh yeah, these must be African descendants, and they are. But it's been relatively recent that they did that. Now, in terms of the genetics, like this part's wild.
You said it's relatively recent that they did that. So he's talking about Polynesians now.
I don't know if
Polynesian.
that's true. Like the afros of Polynesians, like he's saying, like it's relative, like the past few decades that they did afros.
Because I think they've made that argument with the Melanesians, and even that I think is dubious. And they only made that argument because there's some genetic crossover that's they say is more recent. But anyway, I'm not going to go into that right now. But Polynesians, I haven't, at least, I haven't heard the argument made. So this might be, this might not be accurate what he's saying here. Because I haven't made the argument, I haven't heard the argument made for Polynesians, and that is the case. We have so many black presenting populations across the Indian Ocean, across the Indian Ocean and across Polynesia and Oceania. There are so many black presenting populations there, and they exhibit their, and each of them exhibit their kind of melanation in different ways. Some of them through the hair, some of them through the skin, some of them through both. But he's, like you said there, he's trying to make the idea that these bottlenecks have created these distinct phenotypes that are distant from Africa. So he's making a racial argument. So do you see what I remember? Remember that I'm going back to what I said before when I said I hope he keeps the same energy, because I knew this is where he was going to end up.
Yeah,
I knew what he was going to end up doing.
True. That's very, very true.
I don't know. I mentioned this in a post I made on social media the other day. Like my daughter has 40 to 50 major mutations that I don't have.
Wow.
Right. And so for every child, they have 40 to 50 major mutations that the parent doesn't have. Now, it's a testament to how hardy Homo sapiens sapiens are. Like we're a hardy subspecies. So like it hasn't affected her ability to have children,
right?
That we know of. So the species can maintain itself and perpetuate itself. But I have allergies. She has some of my allergies and she has some of her own that are new. They don't exist in my family anywhere. So imagine human beings doing that every generation. Every time a new child is born, 40 to 50 major mutations, and we spread that over millions of years. Let's say we spread it over 2 million years, right? That's a lot of change.
A lot of change. A lot of change.
And that explains like skin color changing, eye colors changing. It explains why, say, people, in the steps of, so to get to the Bering Straits land bridge, you got to go through the steps of Central Eurasia. Or you could just go along the coast, which probably happened too, but it would have taken longer. But imagine it was a straight shot. So you go through the steps of Central Eurasia, they're windswept. So people develop, the Mongolians and people in Western China, been to China, in Western China, been on the Silk Road there. They have, sloped foreheads because the wind has been pounding their genetics for millennia, longer than millennia, hundreds of thousands of years. They also develop.
I'm gonna have to jump in on that one. That's a load of bullshit, respectfully. What? He said that they have sloped foreheads because the wind's been pounding their forehead.
Wait, run that back. I didn't even catch. I was listening.
I'm gonna bring that back. Like you had to have heard that, bro. That's a load of
I was like listening to it, and I was like, wait, what?
listen.
Along the coast, which probably happened too, but it would have taken longer. But imagine it was a straight shot. So you go through the steps of Central Eurasia, they're windswept. So people develop, the Mongolians and people in Western China, been to China, in Western China, been on the Silk Road there. They have, sloped foreheads because the wind has been pounding their genetics for millennia, longer than millennia, hundreds of thousands of years.
Well, it's not been hundreds of thousands of years, according to Out of Africa theory. So first of all, that's incorrect. Even just if you're going to use the modern genetic timelines, we're talking about 70k years. Yeah. But secondly, to add the idea that people's foreheads are sloped backwards because the wind's been pounding it. If you're going to argue that over that period of time that he's talking about, let's say thousands of years, just to give him a pass, even though he'll be incorrect, we get into the tens of thousands of years. Let's say tens of thousands of years. He has to argue that the people with a sloped forehead had a distinct advantage over people with a flat forehead. He has to argue that people with a flat forehead were essentially dying out or not attracted to breed with, because kind of like, oh no, look, the flat foreheaders are all getting sick What is he talking about?
I've never heard
be
that,
argued,
so
not over that period.
I don't even know what to say because I've never heard that before. So I don't even know, like okay, so sloped forehead, like is that because I'm thinking about the brow ridge? Are you talking about the brow ridge or like I don't even understand like what he's referring to, honestly.
And on that note, for brow ridge, the easiest argument to have made for that would have been Denisovan contribution. That would have been a very easy one because if you look at the brow ridge of Denisovans, that is sloped. So that would be an easier argument to make than the wind has been pounding in their forehead, because then you have to make the argument for, okay, but what is the genetic advantage? You have to talk about the fact that the flat forehead is such a disadvantage that it gets selected out. That's what he's arguing there. How do you argue that?
There's got to be much more, because like when we're talking about cladistics, like you deal with diet, environment, like genetics, as you were saying, natural selection, but it being for the win, like that's a new one. I've never heard that before.
Yeah, that's wild. That's wild. Sorry.
Also developed a narrowing of the eye skin, not the socket, because that's bone at the bone level, but in terms of on the outside, the phenotype. So they have narrower eyes in relationship to me, and that's because and longer eyelashes. Why? To filter out the grain and the dust, the wind-blown nature of that environment. So human beings adapted. So to get to
So I'm guessing he's talking about the epicantic fold.
Yeah, the epicantal fold, and I'm like, what? Because
you have to explain its presence in West Southern Africa. You have to explain its presence all over there then as well.
Yeah, like I don't know.
And the fact that epicantic populations with epicantic folds live alongside populations who don't have epicantic folds.
Yeah, exactly. So I didn't even catch this the first time that I was listening to this, but like that doesn't make any sense, and it's kind of following the taxometric approach of the 19th century that he was criticizing earlier.
Yeah. But I think all of this, I'm not going to read too much into this. I'm not going to critique him too much, because I think we know what the effort being made here, which is what you broke down earlier. Yeah, is that all he's trying to do here is paint a picture of physical evolution and divergence from the African. That you can clearly see that's his agenda here. I'm trying to create space between Black Africans and these populations, even though when the Europeans arrived in that part of the world and before they genocided, there were Black people everywhere. But remember, that's what he's arguing against, because people said there's Black people everywhere, but then you have to explain, why were there Black people all across Polynesia, Melanesia, Oceania, and the Indian Ocean? Because that's indisputable. We got 18th century photos in near enough every nation across those regions I've just mentioned, and they all have a sitting Black population, all of them without exception. But now he's trying to create the argument that our modern populations, even that still have loads of Black people, but they're not reflective. These people were all physically divergent from black people.
That they're not Black.
Exactly.
So you know now that even if you look on the Wikipedia page, which I've never been a fan of Wikipedia, but they admit that the Polynesian, got to the Americas before Columbus. Like they've actually admitted that, or they've admitted that there's enough evidence to support that model. And some of those Polynesians were Black, and the Cyphers of the world, the Palmers of the world, they'll say, yep, that's possible, but not African. So like African to them is like the third rail, because it really undermines the idea that North Atlantic technology was able to unite different peoples in antiquity, right? Yeah. Or like North Atlantic technology. It took the post-Columbian North Atlantic technology to unite Americas, Asia's, Africa, and that these people couldn't do it on their own before Columbus. That's the central narrative of Americanist that they're not willing to let go of.
Yeah, well, that's I'd be interested to see. Do me a favor. I think in fact, no, we're not gonna do that on this live stream. It's getting late, so I had another line of inquiry I want to go down there, but I realized. So what I'm gonna do?
One last thing that I wanted to share before the end of it, just to kind of like put a cherry on top. And let me see if I can.
I was gonna let him try and see if we could get to the 60-minute mark on.
Oh yeah, for sure. Let's do that.
Should I hit play, or do you want to show now?
Oh, you hit play. You hit play.
Okay, cool.
The migration piece, it takes Africans a long time to get to the Bering Straits land bridge. They think, so Africans out-migrate. They leave Africa between 80,000 years ago and 60,000 years ago. And eventually they get, by about 37,000 BC.
But he said hundreds of thousands of years of wind pounding their forehead. Do you remember he said that literally just about?
Yeah, he did. He did say that, and that could have been a mistake.
Now he's back to the 70,000 years, which is what I said earlier. For that out of Africa, so it's like,
okay. I'm going to assume that he misspoke.
Or maybe they just lived in a windy part of Africa and then took a windy route to a windy out of Africa route. So maybe they've just been hit by the wind for their entire existence. Sorry.
37,000 years ago, they get to the Bering Straits area and they're migrating out of Siberia across that land bridge. But after they cross that land bridge, the bridge collapses for a certain amount of time and they get stuck in limbo for about 20,000 years. Those 20,000 years were enough time for their biology to change enough that when they eventually go settle, they move south, right across the bridge. Once this,
I'm sorry, but we just do not know enough about, those archaic Native American populations for him to be drafting a story this detailed. We literally don't know enough. We don't have nearly enough ancient kind of archaeological evidence for him to be making such strong claims about that.
No, and there's a lot of parasites that are found in Africa and the Americas that wouldn't make it across Beringia. They would have had to cross along lower altitudes. So,
but it could be like the sailing monkeys,
or the sailing rats.
The sailing monkeys or the sailing rats. And they'll find a way. So, as long as they're not human.
No Africans. It's too politically inconvenient.
Glacier prevents anyone from moving across it. It's a glacier and the glacier breaks. These people are kind of in limbo where they can't go forward and they can't go back. And their genetics change, and that's where they develop the A haplogroup, right? So then eventually they migrate south. There's people often who say, oh, Clovis, the Clovis culture, and they'll talk about this, which is a culture in the southeastern United States, and they'll say, well, that dates to around 13,000 BCE, and then also you got some of the first footprints you find in Arizona, human footprints around 23,000 BCE, and so we know like those people were here, and they think
there's a pre-Clovis as well, like in the West Coast, right?
That's right. That's right. And they think that there's a place in the West Coast, and then in Montana, they've got some remains that are particularly old. Now, ironically, they thought they were older than they actually were because there was wood that was buried with skeletal remains, and they tested the wood using radiocarbon 14 dating. There's other types of dating, but they used that then, and what they said was, oh, this is 30,000 years ago or whatever. But then they realized when they tested the genetic material from the human remains, it was much younger. Right. And so they were like, well, how's that possible? Then they realized, oh, wait, this wood is backwash. That must have been petrified wood from the glacial period.
So I'm interested to know, and maybe you'll have the answer to this. The dating of the human remains was done by carbon 14 dating, or was done by genetic? Were they estimated? It was carbon 14 dating.
Okay. Yeah, it was carbon 14.
Okay, fine. Okay.
Washed into these settlements, and then when the glaciers receded, people were out harvesting wood, and they find this wood and they bring it back to their fireplaces. They put it in their hearths, and eventually they die. So now you've got really old wood next to much younger humanoids, human beings. Right? And they figured out a way to test for this, so they could test at the same site, and they can differentiate between these types of materials. So I'm a nerd for science. So I'm not a science. I'm a social scientist, not a hard scientist, but it's very, very cool how that works. So basically, there's two theories about how the Americas were settled. One is the Bering Straits land bridge approach. And when in social science and in the sciences, when we say it's a theory, we mean that it's amassed quantum of evidence that makes it the most likely scenario.
It's not a theory that you just pulled out of your randomly, like how some people think that a theory and scientific theory are the same thing. It's absolutely not.
Yeah, absolutely not. And I always draw a distinction, like there's a popular cultural use of the term theory, and there's a scientific, social scientific use of the term theory, and they're not the same. Right. So that's one theory, is the Bering Straits land bridge. Actually, it's one huge theory, but one part of it is the Bering Straits, like overland migration, and the other one is oversea.
Yes.
And so there's, this idea, we know that the water levels on the, like, take the west coast of the United States as an illustration, all the way up through Alaska. At some point, those water levels were much higher and less passable, and then eventually they receded down to the present day level. But glaciers had to melt, which caused the water level to rise and made the seas less passable in some cases and passable in others. So, and then there's a third note, which is there is a unique genetic cluster in the Amazon that we know came from like south from the South Pacific.
Right.
But it's extremely small, and it's so small, and the genetic footprint does not expand beyond that culture, that ethnic group in the central Amazon enough for scholars to say this must have been a unique event. It was not a continuous chain of migration happening, right? And so when you look now, the other piece is that for the people that came, like, normally we don't talk about like skull types and sizes or anything like that, because this was pseudoscientific, racist, ideologies from the 19th century. Where,
by the way, I know I mention this all the time, but skull types and skull measurements only became racist when Europeans realized that their skulls couldn't be found anywhere. Just to be clear for everyone listening, that's when they became racist. They were absolutely fine with it, and actually they still do it, because in the latest Neuratman study, they're still doing skull measurements, as Camgiverse will know. In fact, in every genetic anthropological study, they still will run those skull measurements. They'll still run all of these tests that they say are racist in our phrenology, in the hope that they're going to find something that they can relate to European or Eurasian populations. So these studies only became racist when they found out that they couldn't find their skull types, the archaic skull types, all clustered with Africans. So, that's one of the reasons why you'll hear this all the time. Oh, it's racist, it's pseudoscience. So you hear even black scholars repeating this, thinking because they've heard white scholars say it, that they did it out of some kind of altruistic, kind of like moral, oh no, we've just gone through World War II, we don't want Hitler coming back. No, it was nothing to do with that. It's because their skull shapes did not match. They can't find their skull shapes in any archaic society. That's the fact of the matter.
And try to expand the definition of Mediterranean skulls to make it European.
Exactly. And their precious Caucasoid skull, which doesn't really even match modern Europeans, but that skull they couldn't find anywhere either. So the skull that they worshipped, and they set an altar around the dolichocephalic skull, which they thought they were going to find in high proportions amongst their populations, the Nordic populations and the Germanic populations. They realized when they started measuring their populations that their populations don't have those skulls. And they're like, oh dear, keep those royalty out of sight. make sure no one measures that queen or that king's head. Okay, it's racist. Tell them it's racist.
Don't let them, by the way, he just mentioned briefly like population Y for the Fuegians. And that's something that like I'm gonna get deeper into, because like he's saying that there wasn't a continuous migration from the South Pacific into the Americas, but botanical evidence proves that false. There may not be any genetic evidence of that population Y, but like there's definitive like botanical evidence from Polynesia and the South Pacific, from bananas and so many different fauna that entered into the Americas before Columbus. So And
in Africa, I wish we could have had are you familiar with the transatlantic flora, the ones that are present in Africa prior to pre-Columbian?
Z maize in the Ife. The Gossypium hirsutum is in Cape Verde from West Africa, and that's a Mexican plant. Obviously coca and tobacco, which is extremely controversial. Then you have biota from Africa.
Well, he talks about that, doesn't he? And he tries to argue contamination
Yeah, he does later on in this video. He does, but I did an in-depth analysis, kind of refuting the criticism of that on our previous live. But that's that in and of itself. Like the botanical evidence and the debates around that could be a whole live in and of itself.
I mean, it's ridiculous. It's only being argued because it's something that they don't want to accept. Do you know what I mean? It's kind of like we're gonna find any way to explain out of this because we don't want to accept that there's been any pre-Columbian excursions across the Atlantic. We, the Europeans, have to be the first ones to have done it, even though the very people who made the journey didn't even try to take credit for being the inventors of the route. This is how their minds work. Like they're literally so delusional. And the fact that you have people, us buying into their BS, they do this all the time. What I mean? They do this all the time where they inherit something and then they just say we invented it and then we just sing along with them. Yeah, we only had contact when they had contact. It's like, like we have to start giving ourselves some credit and some respect, like the fact that the oldest boat in the world, by the way, I'm going to say that I know it's down as the second oldest or the third oldest, but if you do the research, the oldest boat in the world is found in Nigeria.
The Funa.
Yeah, the Funa canoe. That's the oldest boat in the world because the one they found in Europe, that's allegedly, I think, 1,000. So the Funa canoe is 8,000 or 9,000 years old. I can't remember which one. And the one they found in Europe is literally just a log. Yeah, it's a log with a hole in it. Yeah, it's not a boat. And the whole argument for them saying it's a boat is they recreated it and it floated. I'm like, it's made out of wood. Of course, it's made out of wood. Of course, it's a dugout. It's a dugout log. All dugout log is gonna float. But the difference between that and which was like 2 or 3. So it was a 2 or 3 meter long log with a hole in it. And they're like, this is the oldest boat in the world because it came from Europe and they accepted it was a boat. Had no evidence that it was a flipping boat. The Funa canoe, by contrast, is 8 meters long, which is as tall as a 3-story building, by the way. Yeah,
that's big.
8 meters long. Yeah. And in addition to that, they found evidence of a hull and a stern. So even calling it a canoe is a stretch.
Yeah,
this was a definite purpose-made boat, and so that's the oldest seafaring object we have in this world, because I'm not accepting that European log with a hole in it, respectfully. So it's like, this is the thing, they won't so they'll turn up. We will have that kind of evidence in front of us and we'll still refute our own ability to have made that journey. It's like, come on,
it's nonsense. It's just complete nonsense.
Yeah.
So you can keep playing into the hour mark, and then I'm going to share this one last thing I wanted to share, and then after that, it's pretty much, other than the botanical stuff, which we could probably tackle later. That's pretty much all I have.
Super. Let's do that.
Where Europeans were measuring African skull sizes and saying, "See, they're not capable of being smart," and the Europeans. But then all of that broke down, right? They couldn't prove what they wanted to with that pseudoscience, but in Siberian descended people, there is a bridge inside the nose that is unique. It's not found anywhere else, and scholars aren't quite sure if we know it pre-existed in Siberia, and then maybe it acquired like hyper selection in that period when people couldn't move, right? And so now, like that's a thing. And they see that bridge. And if you look at Olmec art, you see it. If you look at Mississippian art from the Mississippian culture, which was in North America, but also had links with trade all throughout the rest of this hemisphere, like we see that bend in the nose. So it's enough.
Just to be clear, that bend is not in the Olmec heads.
It's not. It's in some of the other groups.
Yeah. Like so that would would that qualify in Van Sertima, is it not? Because he said it wasn't. Van Sertima argued quite clearly it wasn't the whole population. It was
that they mixed.
Yeah,
like bone impact. You see both of them in the bone impact. The Jigalancas, who are the descendants of the Olmecs. And I have to say this for the audience, even though Van Sertima did not say that the Malians of Abubakari founded the Olmecs. There's actually a Mexican scholar, Megarejo Vivanco, who actually reconstructed the Mazatul dynasty and the historical Olmecs from the 8th to the 12th century. And according to this scholar, many Mande populations, which would include the Niani or Mali Empire, influenced the development of the historical Olmecs in the contemporary era, especially as it relates to Fernando de Alva Itzulsochil's rendition, where he said that they landed in the Yucatan and they migrated on the sea from the east. They're dark-skinned, they're woolly hair. Other Native Americans said that they're very jovial, they like music. I mean, it's pretty clear, if you want to use contemporary references, who that is.
Yeah, it's funny because I remember I did some very, very early research, and this is going back now probably 13, 14 years ago, where I did a presentation, and I was able to highlight some really clear cultural, one of them being the totem, because that's when I realized that. So it was nice to see the kind of like the actual physical one when I went to the museum the other day. But cultural continuities between specifically Mali and which is the culture that had Quetzalcoatl? That's the Mayan culture, isn't it? Aztec, yeah, the Aztec culture. So that was I was able to find some really strong affinities between those two cultures, and I'm going to try and find that and pull this up.
And by the way, in the first two books of Van Sertima, he actually explicitly states that Abubakari came in the Aztec era. So people who try to say that he was connecting it to the Olmecs, no. Other Mexican scholars did to the historical Olmecs, but Van Sertima didn't in that case.
That's very interesting. That's very interesting. Okay, so over to you now to wrap up with some more sources. Let me just quickly pull this off screen and put yours on screen.
And again, shout out to, Wiz the Dome and, Dr. Aden. This wasn't meant to be personal attack at all, just dealing with the sources. And, I'd be open to having a conversation, with either of those two brothers, so.
Yeah, absolutely.
This is
sorry, before you start again, I'm going to give one more plug, guys.
100%.
Okay.
Yeah.
Kamji's on the channel here. His channel got demonetized. He hasn't been given a good reason. It's because he's a black scholar. It's because he's unapologetic, and it's because he presents the truth unapologetically that his channel's been targeted. So he now making no income from his research that is posted to YouTube. So I will ask you, if you can, make a donation to one of his either his Patreon or Cash App. Please do that. If you can't do that, at the very least, please join his Substack. Let him build his community there, so he still has a way of contacting you guys. And by the way, hit like on the on the live stream as well. Just as we're coming to the, make sure you've hit like. We've got 100, nearly 200 people here. I think we peaked out at, what did we peak out at? Don't think we'll hit that again, but we peaked out at 232. So that's we've sustained a pretty consistent over 200 audience, which is pretty decent for a random Wednesday evening. So there you go. But let me hand over to you, Kamji.
Yeah. So this is going to be a website, from University of California, Riverside. That's a university out here on the West Coast. And this is a compilation from a gentleman by the name of Professor Legner. And what he did was he found these artifacts in Mesoamerica, right? These are sourced artifacts, and he's dealing with the number of terracotta figurines and just figurines in general in Mesoamerica that strongly resemble Africans, whether it's the zygomatic projection depicted, whether it's the dolichocephalic nature of the skull, right? You can just click on these and he sources them, right? Von Wuthenau is a source of this. And for those who say Von Wuthenau's, artifacts are fake, this is from an article, from a personal conversation cited by Hazlitt Vieira, right? From the Current on Anthropology Forum. But even today, the National, Archive of Mexico houses Von Wuthenau's remains, right, in their museums. So they're respected. And many of these were presented in Dakar in 1966 at the Festival of Black Arts. So this is just a compilation, and you can go through and see just the variety of artifacts. Many of them are connected to, the era of Abubakari's voyage. This would be from the 10th to the 14th century from Oaxaca, Mexico, in the Yucatan Peninsula. This one right here is another very, very famous one. Ceramic sculpture dated around the 13th or 14th century. Very, very similar to a lot of the Mande remains from the Valley of Mexico. Amazing. Right, and the list just goes on and on and on. And he has the sources here von Winning in 1968. Bujanao, Wutanao, and this is in central Veracruz. Another example of where you will see, these artifacts, really, really similar to African remains. So this is a very, very good source. I highly recommend that y'all check this out. From Tadalico to the Olmec civilization and onward, it's going to just get into all of the different pieces. Now, if you go to this quote and this reference, this is something that I wanted to note here because it kind of goes into how some of these Americanist researchers try to explain away the connection between Africa and Mesoamerica. So Michael Coe and Deal, Deal is a scholar that I remarked about previously. He actually argued that because of the contact model, Africana studies or Black studies should be banned from the U.S. curriculum. He's from the University of Alabama, and he made this claim. But I'm going to go ahead and read, their points. So this is from Legner. Some researchers have gone the extreme to explain away the African influence in particular. For example, Coe and Deal in 1980, referring to the massive stone sculptures in Mesoamerica, some weighing more than 40 tons, stated, "Much ink has been spilled about the Negroid aspect of the colossal heads. The flat noses with flaring alae, flat faces, thick lips, and so forth. Ever since the days of Jose Melgar in 1869, it is certainly true that these do not look like typical American indigenous people. However, an examination of this and the other great heads will show how very slightly the original boulder or the transported blank has been modified. As seen from the side, a slightly curved line would join the front of the headgear, the tip of the nose, the lips, and the edge of the chin. To sculpt this face with an Indian on the buffalo nickel nose would have meant removing several additional tons of basalt by the most tedious process and would have increased the chances of breakage in transport if the monument had been carved with this. Thus, it was easier and more efficient to produce portraits in this Negroid style."
So it's the most tedious process. Is he talking about carving, which is exactly how they created the statue in the first place?
Yes.
They carved the statue, but they didn't want to make the nose correctly because it was a tedious process to continue carving.
Yeah.
Just to be clear.
And they said,
what the hell kind of logic is that?
The Negro robust nose was easy, but if they had to make an Indian nose, they would have broke off too much. So this is
These
literally
people
the
with their
extent of
copes
arguments.
are just legendary.
The
legendary copes, man. That is unbelievable.
Yeah, it's pretty sad. And look, he gave Clyde Winters a reference in this article. This is from Legner in University of California, Riverside, right? He gave him a bone with respect to this in denouncing, a lot of this racism, which we could call it racism in the way that they describe the Olmec remains. So again, for people who say that there's no archaeological evidence, clear as day, this is clear. You could look at this database. You could look at the sources. This is clear archaeological evidence of African remains, African presence, African contact. And in this article, he said the main piece missing is the genetics, and we've since filled that gap. So again, at this point, anybody who denies it simply hasn't seen the evidence or they are biased. And I will leave y'all with that. Please support Patreon, Substack, hit the Cash App if you enjoyed this show. And, I hope to catch you on the next one.
Yeah. Maybe let's talk, but we're like halfway through, more than halfway through. We're like let's say 60% through.
Yeah.
Maybe let's just finish it up, whilst we got a bit of momentum. Not right now, but like in the next couple of days. Let me know how you're doing for time.
Let's do it.
We'll just do the part 2 and we'll just finish up. I think I've enjoyed this part 1.
Yeah.
And also, it'll give me a chance to just like I'm gonna give the book a fresh read because quite a short book that came before Columbus. So I think I might read and then come with some fresh ideas for part 2 of this. Yeah. Superb, guys. Thank you very much for joining us. Like I said, we've managed to sustain an audience of over 200. So I hope I got well over 200 likes. Thank you for those of you who've been here, those of you who've been participating in the chat. Even though some of you have been very off topic, I'll forgive you, but don't make a habit of it or I'll block you for a few minutes. Okay, try and keep it on topic, guys. Stop talking about religion. Okay. Other than that, though, guys, thank you very much for coming. Appreciate you all. Yeah, and Kamji, members, make sure you get your support over to Kamji's channel. Show the brother that you show the brother some love and show the brother that you appreciate his research, because I truly do. Once again, shout out to Wise the Dome TV and Dr. John Aden, who would love to host for a call and just like pick his brains about some more of this. But yeah, thank you very much, guys. Really appreciate you all, and have a good evening.
Peace out, y'all.
Peace. Oh, actually, let me do a quick shout before all of you log off as well. Shout out to Dregger for his multiple $2 donations. Shout out to Donsational, Kelnari, JJW, Nutter, and Linwood Obama. Sorry, Linwood Obama. I appreciate you all. Thanks, guys. That's it. Peace.